Hello, this is a guy who likes fanfiction and is too lazy to read, so here is Obito Sensei in audio form. Check the description for the links to the author. Obito Sensei Chapter 34. The Village Hidden in the Rain. A megacour was like no other city Sakura had ever seen. It pierced high into the sky, almost to the low gray clouds, a towering edifice of steel and light. Konohagacour was a broad city with many short buildings that sprawled out in every direction, hidden behind tall walls. A megacour was smaller, Sakura was sure, but its buildings were massive, a metropolis that Konoha would never have dreamed of becoming. It didn't have a wall. Instead, there was a vast lake that surrounded the whole village, with two massive concrete bridges leading in and out of it connecting to the land. It reminded Sakura of waterfall for a brief moment, and she shuddered, easily covered by the pouring rain. They had appeared atop a muddy hill covered in dropping trees and slippery grass looking out over the village. Your new home. And the vicious wind and rain that had greeted them immediately was already cutting through her like a knife. Konan sounded amused, and when Sakura glanced at her she was astonished to find the water just slipping right off her, as if she was frictionless. Seems you all chose a particularly lousy day. The boiling chakra that had filled Sakura's body was receding like a rapid fever, and after a second she was left shivering at its absence as she realized just how cold the rain was. She'd never experienced weather like this in the land of fire. When it rained there, it was usually light and warm, and even when it was heavy it wasn't being hurled by an outright evil wind right into your face. Black, she heard Naruto say, and turned to find him at her right. Sasuke was behind her, and when she glanced back he was giving the sky a disgusted look. The rain was slamming down on them all in a solid sheet. So it's not usually like this. Konan laughed. No. This is a pretty nasty storm, she said. Of course, this is the land of rain. She gestured and they began trooping down the hill behind her, chakra keeping them from sliding down the slick mud and grass. Why all the way out here? Sasuke asked, and Konan looked back at him. If you could summon us in, why not just right into the village? A safety precaution, she said easily, as if it were the most obvious and benevolent thing in the world. There are plenty who wish to harm the nation of rain, so even with shinobi like yourself we try not to invite anyone into the village without ample warning. As she spoke, a piece of paper peeled itself off her cheek and flitted away through the crushing rain. Plus, she said in a lighter tone, it gives everyone a chance to enjoy our lovely weather. Sakura snorted, and Konan gave her a grin. They walked in silence for another 10 minutes, drawing closer and closer to one of the bridges that led into the village, and eventually the mud gave way to concrete. As they walked, Sakura watched the village and her friends. Konoha never slept, but it looked like AIM never even bothered to close its eyes. The whole city was lit up everywhere she looked, strung with power lines and bridges between the towering buildings. There were glowing neon signs and elaborate designs, faces and animals and kanji, carved into the buildings and covered with their own lights on everything, a unique tapestry that stretched over the entire city. Sakura couldn't hope to take it all in with a single look. She could have stood there staring at it for the rest of the day and still been picking out new details, she was sure. Her teammates were easier. Neither Naruto or Sasuke were showing a hint of regret. They both marched alongside her, unfaltering, and when both of them caught her looking they gave her a smile, Naruto's cheerful and Sasuke's amused. She still didn't understand why they'd come, even after their explanation, but she'd given up on that. There was no point in questioning it, she thought, she should just be glad they'd come. Now she wouldn't be alone. You dragged them with you. If anything happens to them, it'll be your fault. Shut up. Now wasn't the time for that. She saw long before they reached the bridge that it was busy, even this early in the day, long before the sunrise. There were caravans of covered wagons moving back and forth across it and dozens of people keeping to the footpaths on the side. The bridge was a tremendous feat of construction, about half a kilometer long and more than 30 feet wide. As they approached, some of the people walking it noticed them emerging from the dark. Most gave them no mind, but there were several shinobi wearing flak jackets and Rain's headband, and they all kneeled as Konan approached and passed them, dropping their heads to the ground. Sakura blinked at the show of deference. Kneeling to the Hokage wasn't something she'd ever seen anyone but Umbu do, but these men and women didn't have concealed faces. One of them was barely older than her, she was sure. As Konan passed, the shinobi raised their heads. One of them, a man with shaggy red hair that was matted down by the rain and a small mustache, glanced at Sakura and her teammates. His eyes went wide, and he elbowed the woman next to him, who had a similar reaction. They were staring at all of them, and Naruto in particular. Sakura didn't know what she would have done in his situation, but Naruto just smiled wide and genuinely, and gave the group a little wave. They rose to their feet and began whispering to one another, the sound concealed by the pouring rain. "You've got some fans," Sasuke grunted, and Naruto laughed. "I'll always have fans," he said, and Sakura couldn't help but laugh at his cockiness, not sure how real it was. If Konan could hear them, she didn't give any indication. They followed her for another couple minutes, crossing more than half the bridge and drawing more stairs with every step. The closer they got, the more Sakura realized that even if Rain had been a minor village once upon a time, it definitely wasn't now. Even Konoha did not get this kind of traffic at this time of day. A megacooler had all the energy of a country's capital and hidden village rolled into one. At the halfway point of the bridge, they came to a sudden stop. Konan held up her hand and turned to them, taking in their soggy state. "Sorry about that," she said, and Sakura shrugged. "We'll get you out of the cold." She dropped her hand and gestured at Naruto, and Sakura looked between the two of them in confusion. A second later, Naruto's feet lifted off the ground. Guys?" Naruto asked, and Sakura reached out to grab his arm in alarm. She could feel him drifting farther up, dragging her arm with him. "I think I'm getting abducted." There was a sudden tug and he was yanked out of Sakura's grip. She and Sasuke watched with no idea of what to do as Naruto floated away, picking up more and more speed as he began rocketing towards a megacooler and cutting a swath through the pouring rain. In just a second, he had vanished into the skyline, out of sight. "What?" Sakura asked, looking back at Konan. "What did you do?" Konan pointed at Sasuke, and he lifted off the ground as well. Unlike Naruto, he didn't struggle, he just crossed his arms with an unimpressed look as he was sent flying off into the sky, refusing to change his posture at all as he soared into a megacooler. It was a show, Sakura thought with a blink. She looked around, not bothering trying to catch her teammate, she was focused on the other people on the bridge. Civilians and shinobi alike were pointing and gasping in awe, a couple whooping enthusiastically. Like a little Chunin exam for each new arrival, showing anyone who was around just how powerful Rain was, that they could scoop someone up and drag them inside without any effort. Posturing for foreigners, reassuring the local ninja, and even if they didn't mean it that way, a threat for new defectors. "You won't be able to just walk away." Konan saw the flash of realization in her eyes and smiled indulgently. "You'll see them in just a moment," she said, and as she did Sakura felt an infinite and irresistible gravity gently seize hold of her. Her feet lifted off the ground, and for a second the feeling of total weightlessness overwhelmed her. The rain stopped hitting her. Sakura blinked. She was still outside, only just picking up speed, but she wasn't getting wet anymore. She moved her hand out as she started accelerating, moving farther from the bridge every moment, and watched with open fascination as her hand cut through the rain. It was still wet, but any additional drops that hit it were turned away by an invisible force, rebounding off and soaring into the dark. She was wrapped in a thick invisible chakra of incredible power that was sucking her up into the city at a ludicrous speed. What kind of technique was this? Less than a second had passed, but she was already so far from the bridge that she could barely see it. She was rushing up and up, straight towards one of a megacooler's tallest towers, already over the other ridiculously tall buildings. Sakura felt her heart start to beat out of her chest, her brain finally catching up to her insane speed. She was going to crash, she was going to splatter across the skyline. The building was right there dash. And then, just as she was sure she was going to strike the tower, Sakura stopped. It was a stop without a stop. There was no inertia, her velocity went from past the speed of sound to zero, and Sakura's head didn't even bob forward. That total impossibility only made her heart beat faster even though she was no longer hurtling through darkness. The rain started hitting her again, and Sakura was gently deposited on a balcony that jutted out from the tower's upper levels. It didn't have railings, and she immediately shuffled away from the edge, not wanting to look down. She'd never been this high up before, and the wind was even stronger here. There was a wide double door made of the same dark steel as the tower, and after waiting for a moment to see if Konan had followed her or not, Sakura made her way towards it, trying to project confidence. She was meant to be here, there was no reason for her to be nervous. They wanted her to be here. Right before she reached the door, it opened, both sides swinging open soundlessly. Konan was on the other side. Sakura stopped, and the woman made a welcoming gesture. Had the other been a clone? That would make sense. One of the Amekage probably couldn't afford to leave the village whenever someone wanted to defect. Naruto and Sasuke are waiting, she said, clearly waiting for Sakura. Come in, won't you? Sakura obliged, stepping past Konan, and the door closed behind them. She was telling the truth, Naruto and Sasuke were both there, already drying off and seated on the floor. They both smiled as Sakura sat down next to them, luxuriating in the dry warmth of the tower. Can we do that again? Naruto asked, and Konan laughed. Stay here for now, she said. The room had 3 different doors leading into it, including the double one that led to the balcony, and she stepped through one of them as she kept talking. It'll be just a moment. Then she was gone, and Team 7 were left alone. They looked at each other, and Sakura could see they were just as much at a loss for words as she was. After a second, she shrugged. Wanna look around? She asked. Sasuke gave her a questioning look, and she raised an eyebrow. The room? I doubt they'll care, he said. He stood up and Sakura mirrored him. Naruto stayed on the floor, leaning back on both hands and staring at the ceiling. It was an interesting design, Sakura thought. The room was circular and the ceiling was slightly raised in the center. It was covered in swirling art of the elements, fire, water, air, earth, and lightning all mixed together and traced intricate figures across the whole space, drawing countless elegant designs. She tried to follow one arc of lightning from its beginning to its end and was lost halfway through in a snarl of water. The room itself was pretty Spartan. There were a half-dozen chairs lining one of the walls, an odd egg-like design with a cushion in the center. There was a short coffee table in the center with mats set around it, but it looked old and dingy. In general, the room looked like people didn't spend much time in it, but if that was the case, why had they been brought here? Sasuke said. Sakura looked over to find him examining the hardwood floor. What? She asked, and he shook his head. Just to know what kind of wood this is, he said, and Naruto laughed. It's wood, he said, rapping his knuckle on it. What's the difference? There was a difference, Sakura thought. They were in a foreign country, in a foreign village, surrounded by foreign ninja and foreign weather. Even the floor was unfamiliar. She felt the enormity of her decision rear up behind her like a hungry shadow and dismissed it with a wave of her hand. She was meant to be here. There was a click, and they all turned to look as one of the doors opened. It wasn't Konan who came through this time, but 2 men instead. They were both tall and lithe, and dressed in simple black armor with a half-cloak covered in the Akatsuki's symbols hanging off their left and right arm respectively. One of them had orange hair and brown eyes, and was the taller of the 2, the other was shorter, with a lazier posture, and had long red hair that almost fell to the small of his back. His eyes were hidden in its shadow. Amekage. Sakura knew it the second she saw them. Both men bled obvious and effortless authority, straightening her spine with just their presence. She remembered what the Hokage had told her before she'd left. The very first test any defector faces in a Megakure is administered by him. Nagato, the man with the Rinnegan. That must have been the man with red hair. The other one was Yahiko. They'd replaced one Amekage with 2 others. Good morning, Yahiko said, and his cheerful voice almost knocked them down. Naruto sprung to his feet, meeting the enthusiasm head-on. Good to see you. Good morning, Naruto said right back, and Sakura and Sasuke echoed him at a much lower volume. I'm Yahiko, Amekage, Yahiko said as he walked right up to Naruto and stuck out his hand. Naruto took his hand without hesitation and gave it a firm shake, and the handsome man gave him a toothy grin. Naruto Namikaze, huh? I'm surprised to see you here. Why? Naruto asked, sounding genuinely confused, and Sakura couldn't tell if he was just suddenly a much better actor or if he was being sincere. Yahiko laughed. You've got a lot of integrity, he said, finishing the handshake and drawing back. To stand by your team like this? You must be fearless. Naruto took the compliment with a grin, and Yahiko's eyes wandered over to Sasuke. And Sasuke Uchiha too, he said, his voice dropping a little. Sasuke gave him a small nod. Yahiko smiled, his entire existence at odds with Rain's cold and dreary reality, and Sakura was keenly aware of how a man like this could have taken over a country. I'm glad to have you here, you know. I'm only here for my brother, Sasuke said. Yahiko's smile didn't crack. And for my team. Then you're in the right place, he said, suddenly quite serious, before he winked as if sharing a private joke. And thanks for the honesty. Yahiko turned to Sakura last and considered her for a moment, stroking his chin with a sly grin. And you, Sakura Haruno. Konan told me you were the most impressive shinobi at the exams. You humiliated Sans Jinchuriki, right? He stuck out his hand, the same he had for Naruto's, and Sakura found herself taking it without thinking, drawn in by his smile. I wish I could have seen it myself. He sounded sincere. Sakura didn't know how to feel about a foreign cage praising her to her face so guilelessly. She shook the man's hand and spoke quietly. Thank you. I'm glad it got Haku's attention. Oh, it definitely did. He wouldn't shut up about you, Yahiko said, and Sakura ignored the jolt of electricity that surged through her body at the thought. Speaking of not shutting up, he continued, releasing Sakura's hand and gesturing at the red-haired man. This is my friend and fellow Amekage, Nagato. He grinned, and Nagato smiled back. As you can see, he's very talkative. Sakura bowed her head, but Nagato stepped forward and stuck out his hand. He moved with much more deliberateness than Yahiko did, as though he were afraid of breaking something with even a small action. He smiled down at Sakura, and spoke in a quiet and calm voice, like a gentle tide breaking against a smooth stone. She could see the gleam of something purple now, behind his hair. It's a pleasure to meet you, Sakura Haruno. Sakura took Nagato's hand and opened her mouth to return the greeting. She froze. Sakura couldn't move. She tried to make a sound, but her mouth refused to move, staying open mid-greeting. She could feel Nagato's chakra rushing from her hand throughout her whole body, the same burning stuff that had invaded her when she'd pierced her palm with the black rod. It was what was rooting her in place. Sakura. Naruto took a step forward, but before he could get far, Yahiko placed a hand on his shoulder. Naruto, he said, and Sakura could just barely watch them out of the corner of her eye. Konan told you you would be questioned when you arrived, right? Yeah, something like that, Naruto said. Sakura's attention was drawn away, back to Nagato, as something started to rip its way out of the ground behind him. She watched in horror as the leering face of a demon tore itself into reality at Nagato's back, staring over his shoulder and right into her eyes. She gagged, blinking in alarm as her tongue suddenly grew heavy. It snaked out of her mouth, slithering through the air and growing longer by the second, and she glanced back over towards Naruto and Sasuke, eyes wide. They were both talking with Yahiko, their voices distant. That's what Nagato is doing, Yahiko said with a reassuring look. It's a technique of his, he's just going to ask Sakura a few questions, and then you guys will be all set, all right. Naruto gave a hesitant nod. He couldn't see it, Sakura realized with a jolt. Not her tongue, not the face. To him, she was just standing there holding Nagato's hand. He glanced over at her and caught her wide-eyed look. His eyes narrowed, but he didn't say anything, he just gave a fake smile and gave her a thumbs up. Sakura. Her attention was jerked back towards Nagato once more. A hand emerged from the mouth of the demonic face, and then another, both questing forward over Nagato's shoulder until they reached her twisting, extended tongue. She gagged, and they seized her, painfully squeezing the thing coming out of her mouth. Sakura knew she would have been jittering if she could, but her body was still frozen. It wasn't a tongue coming out of her mouth, it was her chakra, or her soul, something, and the Amekage had just quite literally grabbed hold of it. Her breathing stayed steady, right now, her body wasn't hers. Yes or no questions, okay. Nagato said, and Sakura was allowed to nod. Naruto and Sasuke didn't react, they didn't hear the question, or see her motion. She and the Omekage were frozen to the both of them. Unfortunately, if you lie you will die, so please be honest. Lie and die. The Omekage's words were echoed by the memory of the Hokage saying the exact same thing. He was completely attuned to her right now, and in some way, the connection went both ways. That was why she wasn't allowed to speak, Sakura realized, so that she couldn't ask questions herself. If she could finish her mission right now. I don't want to be responsible for your death, the man muttered, and Sakura could tell he was completely sincere. She nodded again, and he gave her a smile. Is there a trader in Rain who works for the Leaf? Yes, Sakura tried to say, the vibration traveling down the connection between them. Nagato gave her a thoughtful look. Do you know who they are? No. She didn't die, and Nagato's look changed to approving. Then, the important thing. He leaned in, the Rinnegan dominating her vision. Were you sent here to spy on us, Sakura Harano? For a second, Sakura hesitated. It was the starkest binary she'd ever seen. Betray the village's trust, or die. To her surprise, she found herself grappling with it. That was interesting, she thought, that she would even consider death for Konoha. She thought that she had moved past that as soon as she'd taken the mission, but that was childish. Of course it wasn't as simple as just changing her mind, it was how she'd been raised. But in the end, she'd been sent here to betray the village. The Hokage had even told her what to do in this exact situation. Tell the truth, no matter what. Become a loyal shinobi of the nation of Rain, no matter what. Her mission wasn't to die. Even if you have to deceive yourself. Yes. She matched Nagato's gaze without flinching, and he raised his eyebrows. The hands wrapped around her soul released her, withdrawing back into the demon's face with a snap, and it sunk beneath the ground and out of sight. Nagato straightened up and released Sakura's hand, and she was suddenly in control of her body once more. She gagged at the phantom sensation of her tongue filling her mouth, and Sasuke came to her side. You alright? He asked, and she nodded. She's perfectly fine, Nagato said gently. My apologies for that, safety can be an uncomfortable business. He turned to Yahiko, who gave him a curious look. It's just as we thought. Oh. Yahiko asked, giving Sakura another obvious appraisal. Brave of you to tell him. Wouldn't you have known anyway if I'd died? Sakura asked, and Yahiko laughed. Both Naruto and Sasuke flinched in alarm. That part's a bluff, he said, and Sakura had no idea if he was telling the truth or not. It was so strange to have to return to body language and tone of voice after being so thoroughly wired to Nagato's soul. What? Naruto asked. Sakura, what happened? I told him the truth, Sakura said, and Naruto gave her an incredulous look. About why I'm here? As Naruto sputtered, at a loss for words, she turned back to Yahiko. But I was only using that as an excuse. To come here? Yahiko asked. She nodded. I was curious ever since Haku told me about the Akatsuki during the Chunin exam. She couldn't afford to focus on anything else, it was just her and Yahiko now. She had to make this the truth, dig up a part of her where it was and make that her entire reality. Sakura was sure that was her only chance. I'm too young to have seen war, I don't ever want to. My sensei's friends died in the Third War, and my parents both fought in it too. They never talked to me about it even when we liked each other. She shifted, trying to sell some very real uncertainty for another purpose. What Haku told me made me think the Akatsuki were the only ones really trying to prevent that sort of conflict, that all of the other villages, Konoha included, were just stuck on that path, always creating more violence. That's why I wanted to come here, to see if that was true. She gestured at Naruto and Sasuke. They didn't know about my mission, they caught me while I was trying to leave. That's why they're beat up. All the truth, missing some words. She smiled. They refused to let me go alone, and I was selfish. I was scared to go leave, so I let them come. Let us. Naruto rolled his eyes. He'd caught on, Sakura thought. No matter what the circumstances, their teamwork was still perfect. It was either that or we'd beat the crap out of her and drag her back. Ha! Yahiko chuckled. I guess you're even better friends than I figured. He leaned back against the wall, his arms crossed. You felt out of place in Konoha, he said, directly addressing Sakura. You felt like you were asking questions you weren't supposed to. Yes. She didn't have to think about lying, that was completely true. That's all that matters, Nagato said, his soft voice almost wistful. He gestured delicately to the designs flowing across the room. Rain is always happy to welcome spies. He smiled. We are the greatest confluence of spies in the world. Spy Central, Yahiko laughed, and Nagato chuckled. And I'm sure Minato knew that when he chose you, Sakura. He grin went a little sideways. You being sent as a spy isn't a problem. I don't even know how I'd do it, she admitted. So that's kinda a relief. It should be. Being a spy is hard. Yahiko said with his easy laugh. You shouldn't worry about it, the only thing you should worry about is whether you can take the nation's beliefs into your heart. He shifted, his posture changing a little, and Sakura cocked her head. For the first time, Yahiko seemed completely serious. He reminded her of the Hokage, the way he'd focused as they'd sat at his desk and discussed her mission. If you can, that's great, he said. But if you can't? His face grew hard. If you don't become a true shinobi of rain, you'll be a traitor to both the leaf and the rain. He was like a knife, so sharp that his words pierced right through her. Do you understand what I mean? Sakura swallowed, feeling her sword at her hip. It wasn't a crass threat, nothing so blatant as I'll kill you. He definitely could though. But the meaning was obvious. She wouldn't have a home. She wouldn't have any allies. No one would trust her, she would be as good as dead, just another rogue ninja with nothing to live for but themselves. I understand, she said. Yahiko's cold face vanished as quickly as it had appeared, and he was back to his normal self. He winked, as if what he'd just said hadn't made Sakura's heart drop into her stomach. The world opened up again as she breathed out, and Naruto and Sasuke and Nagato were there once again, silently watching the proceedings. Awesome, he said. Another one of the doors opened, and two Konans stepped through, apparently identical. Come with me, the one closer to the door said, and Team 7 faced her as one. I'll get you all situated. Good to meet you, Sakura, Naruto, Sasuke, Yahiko said with a jaunty wave as they passed him. I imagine we'll be talking again soon. Until then, get to know the village. He grinned. After all, it's your new home. The door closed behind them, and with no idea of what else to do, Sakura and her friends followed Konan deeper into the tower. ####. After the children had left, Konan waited by the door a moment until the sound of her clone's footsteps had completely dissipated. When it was gone, she nodded, and Yahiko sighed and sunk down in one of the circular chairs lining the walls. Yeesh, he said, and Nagato let out a little laugh. I didn't expect this. It was optimistic, Nagato said, joining him in another chair, to think all three of them would come. His ringed eyes shined with amusement. Too good to be true. And yet that's precisely what happened, Konan said, walking away from the door and pacing in front of the two of them. She'd been just as surprised when she'd met Sakura and her team in that field, but the situation had been obvious to her immediately. The injuries on the boys, Sakura's tense attitude, it didn't matter if she was genuinely defecting or not, she'd been caught in the act and that shame had only sharpened her resolve. But it's a dangerous gift that the leaf has sent us. Very, Yahiko acknowledged. They've got enormous potential, all three of them. He leaned back in the chair, hands laced behind his head. That alone would bring a lot of attention, but the fact we've got the Hokage's son and a genius Uchiha. Too, Konan gently reminded him, and Yahiko rolled his eyes. I'm sure that's why they're here. It's certainly why Sasuke is. To see if it's true. Yahiko said, and Konan gave him an unimpressed look. He laughed. Well, I guess that's sensible. Them being here only puts Rain in more danger, Nagato said. He was always quiet and always focused, and that meant that when he spoke, both Konan and Yahiko always listened. It was always so surreal to Conan that their friend who had been so little and pale as a child now held the power of a god in his hands, but her life had taught her that the world worked in funny ways. Had she ever dreamed of being the head of a village, the object of the whole world's disdain? Certainly not, but that only made it funnier. "What do you mean, Nagato?" she asked, and he steepled his fingers in his lap, staring down at them with his legendary eyes. "The attention they bring will far outstrip their ability for years," he said, and as always Conan was trapped between being impressed and disturbed at just how quickly Nagato could cut to the heart of a person's worth to the nation. Maybe it was because he could see inside them in a way no one else could dream of, or because he had been the Akatsuki's pillar of strength for so long. Even if they're all prodigies, which is very possible. He drummed a finger against his knee. "I saw in her that all of them have already mastered the Raise-Non, at their age. That's a remarkable feat." "That would be impressive," Yahiko said, "but we don't need them for that. Rain already has plenty of powerful ninja." He grinned. "Them being here shows that our message, the Akatsuki's message, works. To others, it'll be proof that even Minato Namikaze's son doesn't believe in Konoha. Or they'll think he came for petty reasons," Conan pointed out. "Sakura grew distant from her parents after the exam according to our sources. Perhaps it was the same for Naruto." She considered the problem, her eyebrows pushing in as Yahiko gave her a funny look. Or perhaps he found out about the mission his father had given her, and the realization that he was willing to send his friend away was the final straw. "It's pointless to speculate," Nagato said with a shake of his head. "What matters is that they're here, and you're obviously determined to keep them." He glanced at Yahiko and the man raised his hands. "Guilty," he said guilelessly. "I think they are spectacular shinobi." He grinned. "And I like them. She's fearless, and so are Namikaze and the Uchiha." "She's not fearless," Conan and Nagato said at the same time, and they shot each other an amused look. Yahiko glanced back and forth between the two of them and laughed, and Nagato made a deferential gesture. Conan smiled and continued. "She's terrified to be here, and she's terrified for her comrades. That was obvious to me." "And to me," Nagato said, his Rinnegan gleaming. "But that only makes it more impressive, doesn't it?" "It does," Yahiko said, teeth shining. "But let's back up." He stroked his chin, an old nervous tic of his that Conan still found endearing. "If we want to keep them here, we'll have to keep their mission running for as long as possible. Otherwise, I'm sure they'll run the first chance they get, no matter how curious Sakura is about the Akatsuki." He glanced back at Conan. "You think they're all here for Sasuke's brother?" "Him and the Nanabi," she confirmed. "It's the only thing that could have driven Namikaze to such rash action, don't you think?" "He's normally such a careful one," Yahiko agreed. "But that'll be tricky, won't it?" "Very," Nagato said, his voice subdued. He closed his eyes. "It will be simple enough to conceal the truth at first. They will expect us to hide the presence of Itaki and the Nanabi Jinchuriki." Conan spoke. "But eventually, Kakuzu will return to the village." She was sure of it, even if the man had not checked in since he'd been given his mission. The ancient shinobi from Waterfall was brusque but loyal to money, and Rain had plenty of that. "Precisely," Nagato said. He opened his eyes. "We'll have to keep him out of the village. The truth would be too complicated for a spy to accurately relay, and that could cause Konoha to behave even more rashly." Conan looked up, taking in the intermixed elemental design on the ceiling and sighing. It was true. If they called Sakura and her friends back in right now and told them exactly what had occurred at Waterfall, they wouldn't be believed. More than that, they'd probably be despised. If they meant to keep them, they would have to hide that until they were converted, or in too deep to consider leaving over personal feelings. The alliance was still fragile right now. It wasn't a matter of loyalty between Shinobi and Kage, but a new and novel relationship where they were almost equals. "The other villages finally see us as a true equal, with a Baijuyu of our own," Yahiko mused, drawing their attention back to him. He was at his handsomest when he was thinking, Conan thought. And a ninja as frightening as Itaki on top of that. "They'll begin treating us more seriously, and even more so when word that a team as promising as this one has defected to join us wholesale." We may not want, more seriously, Nagato cautioned. They'll assume the worst of our every move now. They already did, Konan said with a laugh, and Nagato couldn't help but chuckle. And we've always acted with that in mind. Do any of the villages trust their competition? It's just the way things are. Maybe that's why Taki agreed to work with Kakuzu, Yahiko said suddenly. Konan blinked at his stark tone. Making the other villages respect us more? She asked with a raised eyebrow, and Yahiko nodded. Respect and fear are the same thing to a lot of ninja, he said. Itake knows that, I can't believe otherwise. And since Kakuzu still hasn't returned. He frowned. They're the most powerful men in the world right now, and yet no one knows where they are, not even us. That sort of leverage is pretty unbelievable. His frown grew more severe. We can't let them hold it for long. All true, Konan said, but it's like Nagato said. Right now, speculation is pointless. She stopped pacing, standing before the both of them like a monolith. We should focus on our new ninja. They have enormous loyalty to each other, Nagato said. It's why they're here in the first place. We need to keep that in mind. Splitting them up would be too overt, Yahiko completed the thought with a grin. And turn them against us. Every crass rumor about Rain would be proved true. But we also can't let them stay as a three-man cell, Konan said. That would isolate them from the rest of the village. If the only ones they work with are each other, they'll still be outsiders in Rain. Each of them formed a bond with someone in the team we sent, Yahiko said, and he jumped up out of his chair. Now, he was the one pacing, to Konan's amusement. They were perfectly matched, I'd say. He snapped his fingers several times, recalling the report they'd received from their Chunin exam team and Zabuza Mamakai. Haku and Sakura, obviously. Peas in a pod, that's obvious. Their jutsu are even complementary, it's like it's meant to be. Kabuto and Naruto got along well, and he's perceptive enough to be the perfect bodyguard. Konan nodded, since it was self-evident the Hokage's son would have to be guarded. He, more than anyone else on the team, would attract unpleasant attention from the other villages. And Suijutsu and Suzuki. Yahiko trailed off, and laughed. From what Haku said, they just bickered, but they're teenagers. There might be something there. And if not, Suzuki strikes me as an independent guy. He could operate in just about any cell successfully, I bet. He stopped pacing with a grin. Friendship and trust are a powerful thing, he said, squeezing Konan's hand. She squeezed him back, and Nagato snorted at their show of affection. They're what let us overthrow this country. We just need to rely on them forming those bonds, and they'll do all the work. You're right, Nagato said. As usual, Yahiko. Anything to add besides flattery? Yahiko said with a roll of his eyes, and Nagato gave him a grin. Don't forget that we're dealing with the lives of rather brilliant teenagers, he said. They will surprise us, it's inevitable. You say that our friendship let us overthrow the daimyo, and that's true, but now, we're the status quo in this country, if we're not careful, their friendship could overthrow us. What a cheater, Konan thought. She was sure that Nagato would be just as insightful even if he couldn't read people's minds, but that extra help from the Rinnegan definitely helped. She squeezed Yahiko's hand again and stepped away, regarding both her teammates. Leave them to me, she said. Nagato gave a grateful nod, and Yahiko a curious look. I'll take care of their lodging, assignments, and integration. I believe they're important enough the extra attention will be worth it. She pointed at each of them in turn with a small smile. You keep yourself busy running the country. The nation has to keep growing stronger, and the daimyo's hold on the world weaker. Her smile grew a little cold. More than anyone, we have that responsibility. Things will only escalate now. If you'll take them, Yahiko said cheerfully. I bet they'll prove a handful. I'll take them, she said, planting a quick kiss on his cheek. To tell you the truth, I'm excited. Yahiko blushed like he was still a teenager, and Nagato stood up with a mocking grin. The Omekage left the room as one, returning to their duties as the rain poured down outside, a distant crack of thunder barely penetrating the room. I think this could be the thing we've been waiting for, the last little push that could change everything. Obito Sensei Chapter 35. New day, new you. 2 days since they'd arrived in Omegakure, and for the first time Sakura saw a blue sky. She stopped chewing on her sweet dango and blinked as she looked up through the narrow steel portal to the sky that was visible through Omegakure's towering buildings. The sky looked the same no matter where you were, and that gave Sakura a bit of courage. She looked over to the boy sitting on the railing of the balcony with her, idly sucking on a popsicle. "Does it clear up like this often?" she asked. Haku shook his head with a thoughtful look. "Well, sometimes," he verbally amended. "But not usually this time of year. Rain is pretty dreary until around June. Then it warms up." Sakura stared at him, and then up at the sky again. The last 2 days had been a bizarre blur. After their meeting with the Omekage, she and her team had been shepherded from one place to another, issued a new ninja number, Hitai 8, and equipment first off, and then shortly thereafter split apart. "You'll see each other again soon," Konan had said, but so far that hadn't been the case. Sakura had been given a new apartment, ninja housing that would normally be subsidized by the government of the country but now was simply owned by the village. It was a single-room suite with an attached bathroom, smaller than her parents' home but bigger than her room there. It felt wrong for Sakura that she would be rewarded for defecting with a bigger room with a wall-length closet, whose door was a mirror, and a nice oversized bed, but it made sense to her. Rain would naturally front-load luxuries and preferential treatment for new shinobi, especially ones they'd invested in. Naruto and Sasuke probably had even better places. There was no way the village could afford to give every ninja their own space like Sakura's. Right? Right after Team 7 had been split up, Sakura had met with Haku. The boy had just come back from a mission, his Akatsuki Haori covered in mud and rain. He'd been accompanied by the burly man with a butcher's knife sword that had been with Konan at the Chunin exams. Haku had introduced him as Master Zabuza, and Sakura had recognized the name from their midnight talk. The memory of the smile Haku had given her when Konan had presented her made Sakura shiver. The androgynous boy had looked so ridiculously happy. What had she done to deserve a smile like that? "Are you worrying it won't be as nice as Konoha?" Haku asked, and Sakura shook her head, both as a denial and in an attempt to stay in the present. "I knew it wouldn't be," she said. Haku chuckled. "It's the land of rain after all." "Nation," he corrected absent-mindedly. Sakura gave him a curious look, and he shrugged. "Some of the older shinobi here will give you a nasty look if you call it that. They don't have good memories of the land of rain." "Well, thanks," Sakura said. There'd been an invisible awkwardness between them ever since she'd been reintroduced. How had Haku been so genuine while trying to recruit her when Sakura couldn't say a word without carefully weighing it? Was it because one of them was lying and the other wasn't? The Omekage had told Zabuza and Haku nothing of what they'd discussed. As far as Haku knew, her defection was completely genuine. He'd spent the last 2 days showing her the village. After seeing a fraction of it for herself, Sakura was sure Omegakure was like no other place on Earth. The buildings, the neon, the rain, and the ingenious mechanisms for catching and dispersing it, all obvious. What you wouldn't find before walking through its streets was its unusual diversity. Konohagakure wasn't a homogeneous city, Sakura knew. It had been founded by the Senju and Uchiha forming a partnership, joined by more than a dozen other clans before it had truly been born, and had always welcomed shinobi of every stripe into its ranks in the decades since. It had a large civilian population drawn from every corner of the Land of Fire and beyond. Nevertheless, Omegakure made it look like a bastion of monoculture. Walking the streets of the village had exposed Sakura to more people, music, aesthetics, and food than she had seen in the entirety of her life before coming there. Shinobi formerly of the villages hidden in the stone, sand, cloud, water, and even leaf, some who still wore their old Hitai in odd places, and others who were simply recognizable by their appearance or gear. Civilians too, some citizens and some merchants. Every building was united by rain's steel and iron aesthetic, but at the ground level every shop, apartment building, and personal home was festooned with charms from 1,000 different places, few of which Sakura recognized: mascots, corporate logos, good luck charms, religious icons and little gods that might not even have names. Some homes hung wreaths of tiny paper people with red hair and red clouds. Those, Haku told Sakura, were the signs of those who held the Omekage with a particular reverence, mostly superstitious shinobi. Rain, Sakura quickly realized, was the center of too many things all at once: a political revolution, a gathering of military might, multiple ethnic diasporas, and more. Rain was like a glittering gutter that had collected everything that wasn't welcome in the other countries and villages over the last decade, and it presented such a maddening mix that Sakura wasn't sure she would be able to fully wrap her head around it in 2 years, let alone 2 days. The food was really good though. That was without question. Haku had shown her something called pizza, and even if it was a little cheesy for her taste, Sakura had wolfed it down before they'd wandered out to the balcony for dessert. I don't really know what I'm doing next, Sakura admitted. Haku shifted, finishing his popsicle. Well, most likely you'll be kept in the village on observation for a week or so, he said. Sakura leaned in, smiling at his casual tone. Your teammates too, of course. Exciting that they came as well. He leaned back, and ice danced along his popsicle stick, picking up what was left of the sugar and juice and forming a new, smaller treat. After that probationary period, you'll probably be sent on a mission, possibly with Master Zabuza and I. That will be to officially test your skills in the field, though of course we're already aware they're substantial. Because of the exam? Or did Itaki report that? Sakura didn't voice the question. Makes sense, she settled for, finishing her dango. Haku gave her a curious look. What changed? He said, and Sakura swallowed. If you don't mind me asking. To bring me here? Sakura asked. He nodded. I don't know if I could tell you without sounding like a baby, she said after a second, and Haku laughed. Try, then. Sakura looked down. Her apartment was on the 28th floor of the complex. The street was a dizzying distance down. We got a mission after the Chunin exam. To go find one of the Sunin. Live the lie. Make it not a lie. Tell the truth. The Toad Sage, Jiraiya. He was in the village hidden in the waterfall. Haku's smile faded. Waterfall? He asked. Sakura tried to keep her forehead from scrunching up as she overanalyzed his expression. Did he know something about what had happened to the village from rumors, or from a mission report? Yeah. We found Jiraiya, and then that night Waterfall was attacked. Sakura weighed her words and what they could accomplish. Both by rogue ninja that were after its Jinchuriki, and by shinobi from Konoha that were after our sensei. From the leaf? Haku asked after a moment. Either he was a faultless actor, or Sakura had actually managed to throw him off guard with her strategic truth. They were from a group called Root, Sakura said. Apparently, they were a faction within Konoha that undertook wet work for the previous Hokage. They were disbanded when the fourth took over, and resented that. So they tried to assassinate Obito Sensei. She leaned forward on the railing, sticking fast to it with chakra and stretching out over the street, looking down the 200 and some foot drop. One of them used a mind control jutsu on me and stabbed him with my sword. But he ended up killing them. Wow. Haku sighed and finished off his regenerated popsicle. But what exactly about that? It made me think about how Konoha was fractured, and how there were probably more people like that in it who would kill people just because they didn't know how to do anything else, Sakura said. She hopped back down onto her balcony. And more than that, she said more confidently, when I met Jiraiya, I realized he was the person who had given the Omekage their beliefs in the first place, and Root had wanted to kill them too. She clenched a fist. It made me want to find all that stuff out for myself, and it made me remember our conversation in the Forest of Death. Right then, I wanted more than anything in the world to not just be another shinobi. I wanted to be one who left things better than when I became one. She breathed out shakily, aware of her pounding heart as she lost track of what was the truth. Haku cocked his head. But your teammates he started to say, and Sakura laughed. Got dragged along, she said, before correcting herself. Well, that's not quite true. One of the rogue ninja that attacked Waterfall was Sasuke's brother, and he said he was working for the rain. That's ridiculous, Haku said. Sakura blinked at his harsh tone. The nation would never take in someone like Itaki Uchiha. A mass murderer like that. Sakura shrugged. You'll have to tell Sasuke that. He was convinced Itachi was telling him the truth. About everything, she internally amended. When I left, there was a fight, but he told me that he wanted to come with me to find his brother. After that, Naruto had no choice but to come as well. You're lucky to have such good friends, Haku said, and Sakura blushed. And you're even luckier to have had a revelation like the one you did. Plenty of ninja could have gone their whole lives without a moment like that. I guess, Sakura said a little doubtfully. It had just been self-evident, hadn't it? I feel a little guilty about it. About Naruto and Sasuke. A nod. That's understandable. But they'll both find their own reasons to stay, beyond just you and each other. That's how the nation is. Once you're inside, you start to see the rest of the world clearer and clearer. It'll be the same for them, I'm sure. I'm terrified it won't be, Sakura said. Honesty, honesty. Be Sakura Haruno, defector. What if they never find their own reason? Haku smiled. Then they'll stay anyway. If they defect with you, Sakura, I'm sure there's nothing they won't do for you. Yeah, Sakura said, her heart pounding out of her chest. I hope that's true. ####. A week passed, and Sakura still saw no sign of her team. She wandered the city, spent time with Haku, and learned new routines. She felt listless, with no mission and only a single friend. Haku was good company, but he was clearly the only one who trusted her. She was too new for the other shinobi of the village, even Zabuza, to give her anything but an acknowledgement of her existence. She was detached from the world, like a ghost that could touch but not feel. So she did whatever she could to pass the time. She tried to find new stores and restaurants to visit. She decorated her new room, trying to make it feel like a real home instead of a bed in a closet in a bathroom and a balcony. She read, said that she hadn't brought more books. One of the books she had placed in her final pack had been the gift from Kushina, Tales of a Gutsy Shinobi. Sakura was able to finish it before the week was up. When she put it down, she had the feeling she would have to read it again. Jiraiya was a good writer, though fiction had never been completely to Sakura's taste, and this book was not either. Several things stuck out to her on her first read-through. How disconcerting it was to read a book with her best friend sharing a name with the protagonist. The constant focus on the female body, which made her feel queasy several times. The indistinguishable mark of experience in the writing. Anyone could make up a battle between shinobi and write it down, but the clarity and terror inherent to Tales' battles made it obvious to her that they were likely pulled directly from Jiraiya's life. They were simply slightly too realistic, if melodramatic, to have been completely made up. Small details like the cold feeling of running low on chakra and the barely noticeable sting and shock of shuriken slicing through flesh sang through the writing and made Sakura remember her own past aches and pains. The most obvious to her was the sincerity behind the book. Tales was an anthology about the gutsy shinobi Naruto, who was constantly underestimated and put down because of traits that were considered inappropriate for a ninja. He was honest and a little dumb, but he approached every situation with all of his effort. Maybe names had some power, Sakura thought. But what made Tales different from the average shinobi action fiction you could pick up in any bookstore and forget before you put it down was its focus on empathy and understanding. Naruto usually didn't win just by outsmarting the enemy shinobi and beating them up. He learned why they were the person who they were, and used that to find a victory, either by convincing them to change their path or having some new knowledge that let him defeat their usually ridiculous jutsu. And of course, he never gave up, no matter what. That persistence was what let him reach that revelation in the first place. Why don't you give up on making me give up? Sakura wasn't a literary analyst, but it became obvious to her by the time she was done that Jiraiya had put a lot of himself into this book, and that he truly believed the best way to defeat someone was to understand them. But what did that mean for his ideology of ninju, and the ideology of the nation of rain that it had spawned? That, Sakura needed more time to think about. She'd left the book half open on her nightstand, laying face down and open to a page where Naruto cut out a shinobi's stolen eye. 8 days after they'd arrived, a shinobi she didn't recognize came calling for her. When she opened her door, summoned by the sharp triple rap upon it, she found a woman on the other side. She was a shinobi in her middle age, perhaps her 40s, with sharp features, dirty blonde hair, and gentle green eyes. She only had a couple inches on Sakura, and that more than anything made Sakura start as she realized that she'd spent the last year shooting up in height, that she was already almost level with an adult. "Sakura Harano?" she asked, her voice as gentle as her eyes, and Sakura nodded, unsure of what to do. The woman wore her hitayate in a traditional manner, tucking her hair back in a ponytail and covering her forehead. "May I come in?" Sakura stepped aside and made a soft affirmative, and the woman looked around taking in everything as she stepped into the room. She smiled and sat down on Sakura's bed, clasping her hands in her lap. "My name is Nono Yakushi," she said. "Yakushi? Like Kabuto?" The older woman noticed Sakura's look and nodded. "Yes. You've met my son, I take it?" "Yes ma'am," Sakura said, standing at attention. Even sitting down in a casual pose, the woman commanded attention. "How can I help you?" "Well, you're a smart girl, aren't you Sakura?" Nono said, and Sakura couldn't tell if she was simply sincerely sweet or sarcastic. "What do you think?" Sakura crossed her arms. "Haku said I would probably be given a mission after a week or so," she said, and Nono nodded. "And I really hope it's that, 'cause I think I'm gonna die of boredom otherwise." "Do you like going on missions, Sakura?" the woman asked, and Sakura raised an eyebrow. "It depends on the mission, I guess," she said. "But I definitely like it more than just sitting around, without my friends. I feel useless. I came here to be useful." "Well okay then." Nono shot up with sudden enthusiasm. Sakura almost jumped back in surprise. "In that case, let's get you out of here. Meet me at the Eastern Bridge in 30 minutes, all right?" She winked, striding out the door. "Looking forward to it." Sakura watched her go in shock, and when her door closed began looking around frantically. A mission? Her first mission for a megacour? It had been so long and yet she'd thought she'd have more time, the days passing in a blur like turgid lightning. What kind of mission was it? Nono hadn't even said. "Calm down," Sakura thought as she began to pace. This was part of the test. "How do you, Sakura Harano, defector, pack for a mission you know nothing about?" That's something that tells them something about you. What do you want to tell them? What's the truth that you don't want to hide? Jack of all trades is a master of none, but usually better than a master of one. It took 15 minutes for Sakura to pack a generalist pack, enough food to last 3 days, a change of clothes, 24 kunao and half as many shuriken, 10 feet of steel wire, 20 of rope, and more. She was gripped by a sick déjà vu. This time her father wouldn't be there to pack her a sandwich and get a peck on the forehead. She was alone in this room, alone in a building filled with people in a village bursting with more. She felt something hot well up in her eyes, and shook it off with a grunt. She slipped on her frilled jacket in her sheath, the sword concealed under the pink frills, and then shucked on her pack and made her way towards the door. She stopped, looking at herself in the wall-length mirror. Her hitayate was fine, but she felt like she was missing something. After a second, she looked back at the table next to her bed. There was a lacquered black box sitting on it, Konoha's leaf carved into its top. She slipped back to her bedside and opened the box, its golden hinges silent, and stared down at the bespoke blade within. She'd never taken it out of the box before. Even looking at it made her stomach twist. "I hope you like it." Sakura reached down and picked up the knife, feeling its perfect balance for the second time, the way her chakra slipped into it as naturally as water into a cup. She spun it once, and then placed it in a smaller sheath on the other side of her hip from her sword. She'd never used that one yet either. She let out a sigh. "Ready." Sakura left from her balcony, gently closing the sliding door behind her, flitting through the dense upper reaches like a sparrow. Up here, she was just another shinobi with a pack, a megacour was full of them, hundreds of other ninja bouncing from building to building on errands as they navigated the urban forest of balconies, signs, power lines, communication cables, and 1,000 other obstructions. For a ninja, all of the hidden rain was navigable from the lowest alley to the highest rooftop. The rain today was light, barely a drizzle from the gray sky, and Sakura didn't even notice it as it dappled her hair and jacket. She took her time making her way to the bridge, wondering who she'd find there and knowing she still had about 15 minutes. What day was it? She'd partially lost track in her mini-purgatory. Tuesday, she was pretty sure. The city was bustling with life. An older couple gave her a cheerful wave through their window as she rocketed past, and she didn't even have time to give a hesitant wave back. The streets below surged with activity, markets that had sprung up overnight and moved with the crowds filling the air with excited shouts and the smell of food, perfume, and incense. It was all still overwhelming, and as the buildings started to become shorter and smaller at the edges of the village, Sakura was glad to leave the noise behind. She bounced down an alley and walked out into one of the main thoroughfares, trying to control her breathing as a gaggle of screaming children ran past. When she arrived at the wide bridge 5 minutes early, Nono was already waiting for her. "Hey, you're timely," the woman said as Sakura approached. She was leaning against one of the huge railings that span the bridge and staring out over the lake. "That's good. Will it just be the two of us, Yakushi-sensei?" Sakura asked, and Nono waved her off. "First off, I'm not your sensei, so don't even think about it," she said. "Please just call me Nono." She smiled. "The Omekage believe you're independent enough that you won't require that, Sakura." "I appreciate that," Sakura said, and she did. Even if it might be a ploy, the notion that she was trusted enough that she didn't require a new sensei here gave her a weird satisfaction. Was this their way of saying she was a Chunin? That would be funny, both here and in Konoha, and at the same time. She suppressed the giggle. "Second," Nono continued, "we'll be accompanied by one other." She straightened up. "The Chunin exam may have given you a different idea, but the Nation of Rain organizes its ninja a little differently from Konoha and the other villages. Are you okay with that?" "Of course," Sakura said, letting her curiosity burn. "How is it different?" "Most villages organize teams of 3 with a jonin or special jonin leader." Nono stated the obvious. Though naturally in wartime those organizations become more fluid, with squads combined into larger teams, platoons, and companies. "I hope you're familiar with that." Sakura nodded. "I'm sure if it came to war Rain would be the same, but our peacetime teams are organized in cadres instead of squads, each has 9 members. 9. But not for every mission, that would be too many," Sakura said. Nono smiled. "Precisely. So instead, that group of 9 is normally split into flexible teams of 3, though it's not impossible they could all be sent on the same mission in some circumstances." She gestured towards the village. "So for example, the cadre that you're a member of is Cadre 33, which was newly created when you and your team arrived. All 3 of you are members dash." Sakura tried to suppress the thrill of excitement she felt at that news. They were still in the same team. They weren't getting split up. "Along with myself, Zabuza Mamakai, and myself," Haku said, and Sakura spun in surprise to find him behind her. He gave her a playful grin. "Who will be coming along on this mission?" "Haku!" she exclaimed. "Does that mean Kabuto and Suijutsu are in the cadre as well?" "They are," Haku said. He looked a little different, Sakura thought, covered in almost a dozen tiny packs, his Akatsuki half-cloak concealing some of them, and his hair pinned up with 2 senbon. He was frankly beautiful. "Along with one more shinobi who you haven't met yet." "Right," Sakura said, trying to get the word beautiful out of her head. "Number 9. Who are they?" "A girl named Karen," Nono said. "You'll meet her soon, I'm sure." Sakura wondered what she was like, but another question superseded it. "So, where are we going?" she asked, nodding towards the village. "Out of the village, I assume." "You'd assume right," Nono said with an amused look. "We're going to check in on one of the minor villages. They've expressed interest in a partnership with the nation, we are only going to get the lay of the land." "Which village?" Sakura asked. Haku laid a hand on her shoulder, and she jerked at the touch. "Waterfall," he said soberly, and Sakura froze, the rain pattering against her face. "Waterfall?" She didn't want to go back there. She tasted ash and fire. "We've long resisted becoming Leaf's ally." Sakura blinked. "Okay," she said. She noticed Nono's lack of reaction. Haku had already shared this with her, she was sure. Had she been selected for this mission specifically because of that? All that only took a heartbeat to process, and then Sakura breathed out. Okay, she said again, and then cracked a smile. I didn't think I'd be going there again so soon. Good attitude, Nono smiled. Sakura couldn't escape the feeling that she was being graded. Shall we, then? If we leave now, we should be able to make it there by sunset. Waterfall was closer to rain than the leaf. Was that why they were reaching out to the nation? Or were they reaching out to both, weighing their odds? Sakura didn't know, but the question burned inside her. She'd just barely arrived, and already she could see the weight the nation of rain was applying to the world. Assuming Nono was telling the truth, of course. They left rain behind, and Sakura with her thoughts. Hashtag. Haku and Nono were good traveling companions. They cracked jokes, pointed out interesting sights, and told Sakura about their past missions as they traveled. She tried to reciprocate, but that awkwardness was still there, the invisible barrier of novelty. Nono had been right. They reached territory Sakura recognized shortly before the sun began setting, casting brilliant red light across the treetops. Traveling through the land of rain was interesting. The rain seemed to have a life of its own, pounding down in some places and barely present in others, and its constant presence had ground down the nation into mush for long stretches of their travel. Rain was filled with stretches of wasteland where nothing grew, old battlefields, Nono told her, with the indisputable authority of someone who might have been there when they were created. It was a patchwork country, peppered with forests and grasslands and swamps and dirt. What had she read? That conquerors and colonizers had taken most of rain's natural resources in an endless series of conflicts? The scars on the land were so obvious that even she could see them. It made Sakura reflect on how she'd never seen anything like it in the land of fire. Her home country had never fallen prey to armies rampaging without limit. But as they entered the land of waterfalls, the forests grew thicker, the wildlife more common, and the sun lower. Eventually, Nono brought them to a stop with a raised hand. Sakura missed teleporting. She didn't mind the long-distance running that most shinobi used to travel, but she was definitely realizing Obito's Kamui had spoiled them. We're on the edge of their patrol area, Nono said. I'm sure they've been told we're coming, but we should still move slow and steady, all right? Of course, Haku said as they tightened their formation and began walking together. They patrol in teams of 3, Sakura said, the memory drifting back to her. 2 less experienced shinobi and a team leader. Sorta like this one, she thought. Though maybe that's changed, after what happened. Probably not, Nono said with a shake of her head. Waterfall, even more than any other village, needs to keep up a show of strength. They can't afford to lessen their patrols. Right, Sakura said. She was surprised at how violently her skin was crawling. They weren't even in the village. Had it made that much of an impression on her? No, she thought in a moment of welcome clarity. It hadn't been the fire or the blood, it had been the way she'd been kidnapped out of her own body. Root was what scared her, not Waterfall, and the man who'd squeezed her soul in his hands was dead. Her sensei had killed him. The thought brought her some peace, and the fear eventually drew back. It was replaced by the feeling of being watched after about 20 minutes, and Sakura began looking around, seeing Haku and Nono make the same tiny motions. Just like last time, they were being observed and not confronted. After 3 minutes of moving closer to the village without being challenged, Nono stopped and cupped her hands over her mouth. Shinobi of the Nation of Rain. She yelled, and the trees rustled. With animals or shinobi, Sakura couldn't tell. We're here to speak to your elder. Elder? Were all the others dead? At that moment, Sakura couldn't remember. A minute of silence passed, and then another. Nono didn't flinch or hesitate, just standing between the trees with her hands on her hips. Right as Sakura began to believe they would be ignored or attacked, a young boy popped out of some bushes about 30 feet away, only showing his head. He couldn't have been much more than 7 or 8. You're early. He cried out in a high-pitched voice, and Nono shrugged. We left early, she said with a gentle grin, and the boy regarded her uncertainly, looking back and forth between her, Sakura, and Haku. All girls. Sakura saw him mouth, and she had to suppress a laugh. I'll lead you in, he said out loud, filled with all the authority of a child that had been given any measure of power. He spun around, striding through the forest towards the village, and Sakura's team followed after him. It was a familiar journey. The towering edifice of the plateau waterfall stood atop, and the claustrophobic tunnels that traveled up through it much less intimidating on a second viewing. Sakura barely paid attention as they walked, stuck in her own mind and grappling with an old thought. It wasn't a coincidence that she'd been chosen for this mission. What made the most sense? That Rain was using her as a prop to show that they could recruit Konoha shinobi? No, it couldn't be that. She'd already been there. They would have sent Naruto or Sasuke. It was a different reason, but she couldn't figure out what. They reached the top, and Sakura stopped right before laying eyes on the village. To test her loyalty, maybe? Sending her to a neutral territory, so soon after she'd defected, to see if she'd run? To see how she would deal with the shinobi of Waterfall? It was a little crude, but it made the most sense. If she left the village and came back, that would be proof of at least her dedication. The thought let her take a breath in, and then Waterfall immediately took it away. The sight of the unmarred village and its beauty had burned itself into her brain, and she hadn't had time to see it from a distance after the devastation Itaki had wreaked on it. Now, she could see the damage in full. Half the village had been completely consumed by flames, and was still in the process of being rebuilt. It was covered in shacks and tents, temporary housing crowded with people of every kind. Waterfall was isolated and mostly populated by shinobi. Sakura could see right away that rebuilding would be a slow process without the usual civilian and daimyo contractors that Konoha used for construction. The great tree was seared on one side, nearly 100 feet of thick bark burned to charcoal like a huge swath of ugly paint. The top of it was missing. Sakura had no idea how that could have happened. The whole tree was ragged where it had once been sweeping and gorgeous, cut through by fire and other forces that Sakura couldn't guess at, gaping holes blasted in its canopy. Some of the rings had been damaged, water pouring freely from them into the lake. Sakura blinked, felt her throat clench. Waterfall had been a beautiful place, but now it looked like a plate that someone had dropped off a table. Nothing fit together, some pieces would be missing forever. You know where to go? The boy, whose name they hadn't learned, asked, and Nono nodded. He grumbled. Then I'm going back to patrol. He scurried back into the tunnels and left Sakura's team to their own devices. It's an amazing place, Haku said with genuine appreciation, and Sakura glanced at him. He couldn't see the full picture, she thought. He couldn't see what Waterfall had suffered. Because of Itaki. Because of Rain. She took a deep breath. It was even better before the attack, she said. Haku nodded thoughtfully. I'm sure, he said. Still. I've never seen a place shaped by shinobi like this. They're rare, Nono said, striding forward onto one of the paths that led through the lake to the village's center. Most shinobi only know how to destroy, after all. The thing that shinobi supply is violence. Sakura followed the older woman in a daze, chased by the echo of the past as they made their way into the village and began ascending its rings. They drew looks everywhere they went, shinobi eyeing them cautiously as they went around the business of rebuilding their shattered home. They were obvious outsiders, Sakura thought with a flash of self-consciousness. And her, an outsider among outsiders. They continued all the way to the center of the ring, to the longhouse that had been filled with squabbling elders the last time she'd seen it. The building was unmarked by fire. It had been one of the most heavily defended sections of the village, and the blaze that had consumed so much of Waterfall hadn't reached it. There were more ninja standing guard around it than anywhere else, and as the Rain shinobi approached they watched them with paranoid eyes. Nono came to a stop at the top step, clasping her hands behind her back, and tilted her head with an innocent smile. Would you inform the elder we've arrived? She said in a sweet voice, and two of the shinobi glanced at each other. One of them, a woman with long blonde hair, muttered something, and slipped through the door and out of sight. They're jumpy, Haku noted. Sakura shook her head. Their home was destroyed in the middle of the night, she said. The boy took note of her heavy tone. I can't believe they're even letting us in. The woman re-emerged and made a curt gesture, and Nono stepped forward. Stay by my side, she muttered. Haku and Sakura obeyed. They were shuttled into the building, ninja from Waterfall at their front and back. The back of Sakura's neck itched, and she looked back. A ninja had slipped out from behind the door to follow them, leaving the blonde woman at the door. She blinked at a jolt of recognition. It was Osaka, the blue-haired girl that had escorted her in the last time she'd been here. The older girl was looking down at her with hateful eyes, her lip curled up in disgust. Sakura met her gaze, unable to look away as she followed Haku and Nono further into the building. The girl looked like she wanted to say something, but reconsidered it after a second thought. Her eyes continued to burn into Sakura's back as she kept pace with them down the corridor. Just like last time, the soundproofing was absurd. Sakura couldn't hear the argument until the door to the central chamber was opened for them. I don't care about excuses. A young man was shouting. If you can't do it, find someone who can. He slammed his fist down on the room-spanning table, now far too big for the room with so few people in it. There were only 3 other shinobi in there with him, all older, all strictly at attention. Sakura recognized the voice. He was the elder with 2 swords strapped to his back, the one who had argued they should have just kicked few out of the village. He was the only one left? She felt her face twitch in anger. As she did, the elder looked over at their entrance with cold eyes, glancing at each of the new arrivals in turn. Sakura, he lingered on for a second longer, a hint of confusion in his expression. He dismissed his shinobi with an angry wave of his hand, and they shuffled out of the room stoically silent. The shinobi that had been escorting them in, Osaka included, replaced them. They weren't allowed to be alone with the elder, that much was clear. What had his name been? Eiji? Sakura struggled to remember anything she'd learned after the battle for the village. You're early, he grunted, taking a seat and rubbing his temple, and Nono gave a slight bow. Haku and Sakura mirrored her, and the man snorted. Please, don't flatter me. We're not here to flatter you, Elder Eiji, Nono said diplomatically. Sakura felt a bit of satisfaction at getting the name right. Only to offer our village's support in your trying times. Yeah, we've heard a lot of that, Eiji said, crossing his arms. Let me get your spiel out of the way, huh? Is it gonna be a tithe, loans, or submission? He started propping up fingers and mockingly knocking them down. We can't afford to give up any part of our mission profits even if we wanted to, so you can fuck off with that. We don't have the ninja to spare. I'm sure a clever group like the Omekage know that, so you know. He grinned. And Waterfall will never integrate with another village. This is our home. So if you don't have anything else dash. The Omekage are not fools, Nono said mildly, and Eiji rolled his eyes. Sakura was frozen, watching a conversation she'd never been a part of before. Was this how all the villages conducted diplomacy, or just Waterfall? If it was, no wonder there had been 3 world wars. They understand asking Waterfall for concessions at the moment would be an insult at the very best. She removed a piece of paper from her jacket, Conan's paper. Sakura couldn't help but wonder, and slid it across the table. That is why they would prefer conditions instead. Eiji laughed, snatching the paper up with a dismissive look. There's no difference, he said, unfolding it without looking at it. A condition is just politely asking for a concession. He glanced down at the paper, and his eyes went wide. There was silence in the room for more than 10 seconds. Sakura and Haku gave each other a look, both clearly wondering the same thing. Nono was still, her hands shoved in her pockets in a lazy stance. You can't be serious, Eiji eventually said, laying the paper face down with a weak laugh. There's no way even Rain could afford this. Why would they offer it if they couldn't? Nono said, removing one of her hands to examine her nails. The Omekage would look like real idiots if you accepted the offer and then they couldn't come through. Maybe they're idiots then, Eiji grumbled, looking more and more uncomfortable. Plus, what would we do in the meantime? Still take missions, of course, Nono said. You have to keep your shinobi up to snuff, right? It just wouldn't be existential anymore. Sakura had no idea what was being discussed, and clearly Haku didn't either. Eiji noticed her confusion and sneered at it. Before, to her horror, she saw the same spark of recognition in his eyes that she'd seen in Osaka's. "I thought I recognized you," he said, and Sakura realized she was being used as an excuse to delay the discussion. Was this her life now, being used as a tool and a prop? "You were here that night, with the rest of those brats." He smirked. "I didn't realize shinobi from the leaf had so few principles. And after all those fancy words your sensei barfed up. Did he make you sick enough to leave?" Sakura stiffened, her blood running cold. All eyes in the room were on her. "It wasn't like that. Why should I care? Sakura Harano doesn't care about the leaf anymore. The village didn't raise you or train you. Your parents did. Your sensei did, Obito did. If the village was insulted, there's no reason for you to care." All those mild and responsible answers raced through Sakura's head, and then the anger in her heart burned them all away. "You don't know me," she said, and she saw Nono cross her arms, face unreadable. This was part of the test. Be yourself, and you'll pass it. She was sure. She let a sneer creep across her face. "Don't make assumptions." "Oh, testy," Eiji said, amused. "Do you let all your subordinates mouth off like that?" he asked Nono. She shrugged. "You insulted her," she said. Sakura blinked as she realized the woman was backing her up, however neutral she appeared. "Did you think she would stand there and take it?" "She certainly did the night we were attacked," Eiji sneered. "I heard she tried to kill her sensei herself." "Driven mad by fear, were you?" Sakura refused to respond. She just locked eyes with the man, resisting the urge to snarl. What was he trying to provoke her for? A grown man, getting his kicks from picking on a teenager? Pathetic. He was like waterfall itself, something that had once been impressive but now was just sad to look at. Eiji stroked his chin and looked down on her before suddenly pushing his chair out and standing up with a laugh. "Rain's offer is tempting," he said, and Nono nodded graciously. "But it's based on conditions. I can accept that, if you let me add a condition of my own." "That depends on the condition," Nono said. Eiji smirked. "She's a swordswoman," he said, nodding at Sakura. Her heart skipped a beat as her anger was doused by the reality of the situation. "And the youngest among you. If Rain really is strong enough to rebuild our village." He leaned down, elbows on the table, and smiled. "Let's have a duel, like proper shinobi, and if she impresses me, I'll agree to your terms, 100%. Sakura was rooted to the ground. Waterfall's leader had just challenged her to a duel? How petty could he be? He was trying to use her as leverage, of course. If Nono refused, he would go on a track about how Rain could impose conditions on their agreement but Waterfall could not, even obviously stupid ones like this. The man's thoughts were obvious to her, he moved in simple patterns. Maybe his swords would too? Nono was already shaking her head. "No," she started to say. "That's obviously dash." "Right now?" Sakura asked, stepping forward. She let her hand wander down towards her sword, and behind her she heard Haku stifle a laugh. She couldn't blame him, Eiji's expression was hilarious. He'd expected a denial, his rhetoric hadn't been structured to account for acceptance. An overconfident moron, that was the kind of person who would think about throwing away someone like Few. Sakura's thoughts boiled with spite. "In here," she continued. "Or outside?" "Sakura." Nono's voice was unreadable. "You understand what you're agreeing to, right?" "I won't be able to step in," went unspoken. Sakura nodded. "I understand, Nono." She looked back at Eiji. He glared, his nostrils flaring. "I came to Rain to be useful, remember? If this will make him agree to the village's terms, then I'll do it in a second." "Testy and cocky," the elder sneered, standing up to his full height. All of the other shinobi in the room were silent, watching their leader with carefully neutral expressions. Why was he still in charge, Sakura wondered, when his own shinobi seemed to barely respect him? Just tradition, or something else? Maybe, a part of her that had been buried by the anger said, his strength alone could justify loyalty. Too late to take a step back, she had to keep moving forward. "Give your word," Nono said, holding up a hand. "Or this will be for nothing. We're negotiating now." "Why not?" "I'll give my word, and the word of Waterfall," Ag said with a shrug, handing off something of immense value without care. Just like he'd wanted to do to Fu. Outside. The Waterfall shinobi in the room turned as one, making their way out of the chamber. Sakura followed. She had thought her stomach would be turning circles, but for some reason she was calm. If she was a shinobi, and the only thing a shinobi could supply was violence, then the best way she could help Rain and convince them of her loyalty was to win this duel. She didn't have a single doubt. But can't a shinobi do more than violence? Isn't Waterfall proof of that? They trundled out of the longhouse and drew yet more stairs as they fanned out into a semicircle, one half composed of Rain's shinobi and the other half of Waterfall's. The other side of the circle was much bigger. "We should establish some conditions for this condition," Nono said. Ag scoffed. It was a nice day, Sakura thought. The sun was starting to set, casting thick shadows and red light across the plateau. "Blood," he said. "Or screaming to stop. I'll accept either." He sneered at Sakura, once again expecting her to be unnerved. "Sounds good," she said, narrowing her eyes and shucking her pack. She laid it at Haku's feet. She couldn't see any other weapons on the elder besides the dual swords at his back, and as she spoke he slowly drew both of them. They were plain black blades, nothing remarkable that she could see. Possibly chakra conductive metal? She'd never fought two swords at once before. "Tell the rest not to interfere." He barked at Osaka and the others, and they scattered. "I'll be teaching a lesson in loyalty." Sakura gripped her sword, but didn't unsheath it. She also didn't reach for her knife, still hidden under her jacket. She wasn't confident enough to use it yet. "No Yakushi," the elder spat again, a clear note of command. "She's your shinobi, give the command." Nono gave Sakura one last chance. She didn't take it. Instead, she unsheathed her sword. She brought it out alone, there wasn't any water accompanying it. Nono took that as her signal. "Begin." Ag the elder leapt forward as soon as the words were spoken, bringing both blades crashing down in a brutal vertical arc, and Sakura flowed into a defensive posture that Obito had almost literally hammered into her. Her blade intercepted both of the blades in a high guard. Sakura immediately realized she'd made a mistake. The strike was unbelievably strong, her guard almost shattered in an instant. It was like she'd caught a slab of concrete on her sword. Ag growled down at her past his blades as they ground against hers, his arms rippling with muscle as he tried to force his way past her sword. He wasn't bothering with anything she could call technique, only raw strength. Not because he couldn't, Sakura was sure, but because he wasn't bothering to. His strength alone could be enough. "Weak." The man called out, and he kicked out. Sakura let out a grunt of exertion and thrust his blades away in time to leap back, the kick only brushing her stomach. He stomped forward and threw another series of strikes, his swords flashing out. He wasn't as fast as Obito, Sakura thought, but each attack was thrown with so much anger and force that parrying the first almost sent her spinning to the ground. She ducked under the second and skipped backwards, drawing more distance as Ag continued to rush forward, every step a strike and every strike a step. So Rain is the kind of village that lets children represent it. Ag roared, leaping into the air in a brutal roundhouse kick. Sakura ducked the kick, but the man was attacking again before he even hit the ground, spinning low and knocking her off her feet. She hit the ground hard and rolled backwards, out of range of the man's scything blades as he carved at the ground under her. Chunks of rock went flying into the distance as the man's powerful attacks cleaved clean through the stone. "It's pathetic." He reared up, both blades high, and Sakura saw her opportunity. "Shut up!" She shouted back, and kicked herself off the ground, driving her head directly into the man's gut. Ag gagged, rocking back, and Sakura scrambled under his legs as he slashed wildly down at her, only tearing up more stone. She spun back to her feet behind him, leaping over a kick thrown back. But the man was faster than her, another kick struck her out of the air, and Sakura tumbled backwards, falling into the uppermost ring of water that surrounded the longhouse. She came up gasping for air, seeing the area beyond her opponent for the first time. A crowd had gathered, more waterfall shinobi than she would have figured, maybe 24, all watching the fight with interest. Nono and Haku were at the forefront of the crowd. Eiji was stalking forward, twirling his swords and spitting with anger. As she breached the water, Sakura saw Haku raise an eyebrow. She grinned viciously and stood up, pulling herself out of the water and standing atop it. She brought her blade up, and the water came with it. Eiji slowed, his eyes narrowing as Sakura's Ryusuiken took form, the blade beginning to spin and picking up speed. Sakura flourished the sword, drawing more water up. Jutsu, huh? Eiji said, sheathing one of his swords with a swift and violent motion. It was a wonder he didn't stab himself. All right then. He held his other blade out before him, and to Sakura's alarm began making hand signs with his now free hand. There was no announcement of the jutsu, Eiji just spit a fireball bigger than Sakura that roared forward and seared the stone below it. Hey dash! She heard Nono shout out, but Sakura didn't hesitate. She stepped forward and swung her sword with both hands, and the water blade whipped out and cut the fireball in half in an explosion of scalding steam. Sakura shielded her eyes, the blade revving furiously at her side. She heard a splash to her right, the movement hidden by the steam, and swung on instinct. Her blade came around, but before she could complete the attack a hand latched onto her arm with enormous strength and stopped it in its tracks. Sakura's other hand shot down on instinct, towards her waist. The Ryusuiken fell short, but the half-completed attack blew away the steam. Eiji was standing next to her, his hand wrapped around her arm and his blade at her heart. "I'll give you some advice, little girl," he said. He wasn't even sweating, Sakura thought. He had her completely at his mercy. It would be suicide to move. Extending your sword sounds neat, but all it means is that if the enemy gets close to you, your technique is dash. Sakura jerked upwards, and Eiji hesitated. He didn't push his blade forward into her heart. He'd put his sword in a lethal spot to threaten her, but that meant he couldn't actually attack without adjusting it. Not without killing her. Sakura had guessed correctly that despite his rotten attitude, he didn't want to kill her. That meant that instead of dying, she had enough time to flick her wrist and send the tiny blade of water wrapped around her knife flickering upward to cut him cleanly across the chin. Eiji moved his sword, almost as fast, and slashed Sakura across her shoulder, drawing a gout of blood. She didn't flinch, just glared up at him as he crushed her arm. "I could have killed you," he hissed. "You little dash. And I could have cut your head in half," Sakura spat, her whole body shaking with adrenaline. "Congratulations, we're both dead. Let me go." She jerked her arm back and Eiji released her with a grunt of fury. He glared down at her, clearly considering swinging once again, before sheathing his blade. He hadn't even cleaned her blood off of it. Sakura didn't dare say a thing. She could sense her role and things had come to an end. "Impressive," Nono said with a clap, and a couple of the waterfall ninja half-heartedly joined in. "Strength like that is why Rain wishes to be Waterfall's ally, Elder Eiji." She stepped forward, carefully watching Sakura as she stepped away from the older man. "Your village's power can't be questioned." "Ha!" the man said. The short duel seemed to have taken some of his spark away. He wiped a thumb against his chin, smearing the trickle of blood Sakura had drawn, and sighed. "I'm kicking you out," he decided, and Nono gave him an unimpressed look. "But I'll agree to Rain's conditions. If Omegakure rebuilds Waterfall, and supports it in the meantime, we will happily come to its defense if necessary." He flashed a smile, and Sakura saw the handsome charisma that had been buried beneath a bad attitude. "It's the least we could do for such good neighbors." "Delighted to hear it," Nono said. Haku, as ever, was quiet, observing everything with frightfully intelligent eyes. "The Omekage will send another delegation to record the official agreement, of course." "Right, normally something like that would be taken care of by the daimyo's government," Sakura thought, but Rain's government and its village were one and the same, weren't they? The bureaucracy and legality of any treaty fell upon them. "Of course," Eiji said wearily. He gestured, and they were surrounded by Waterfall's shinobi. "Now get out." ####. They made camp under the open sky a little after midnight. They'd made it about halfway back to the Nation of Rain by that time, and Nono had decided that was enough. She had closed the wound on Sakura's shoulder with flawless medical jutsu. Sakura was sure that she had been the one to teach Kabuto as soon as she felt Nono's warm touch. The camp was standard for a shinobi, concealed by the earth, no open flames. They kept themselves warm with their chakra and blankets, and ate small meals they'd packed themselves. "Are you looking to reinvent yourself?" Haku asked when they were nearly finished, and Sakura almost choked on her noodles. "Pardon?" she asked. The boy was peering right through her with his piercing gaze, his haori pulled up and wrapped around his neck like a scarf for a little extra warmth. "Accepting that challenge wasn't something you would have done in the leaf, I think," he said. Nono was staying quiet, she noticed. The woman wasn't judging her, at least Sakura didn't feel like it, but she was always watching. "I went after Gaara," she pointed out, and Haku frowned. That was different. That was just anger. Justifiable anger, but still. This time you were doing it because it would help the nation. "Yeah." Sakura looked down, stirring her noodles. "I guess that's true. I was angry this time too though." She laughed. "I guess I am looking to reinvent myself. I keep thinking that I should be different now. 'Cause now I'm Sakura Harano, someone who defected from Konoha. But I don't always feel like I am." "It's not that easy to redefine yourself," Haku said with a gentle smile. "But if it's any consolation, I'm sure anyone who hears about what happened in Waterfall will think you're a completely different person." Nono laughed. "Without a doubt," she said. "You did do Rain a service if that's what you're worried about, Sakura. I didn't expect Eiji to be so insecure." "I didn't understand it," Haku said with a shake of his head. "He did not seem like a leader. More that they were just following him, if that makes sense." "It's accurate," Nono mused. "Eiji was the newest and youngest elder, and it seems all the rest were winnowed in the attack by Kakuzu," Sakura thought. "He'd torn out their hearts. Theirs and the village's itself." Nono continued. "Waterfall hasn't experienced a loss like that in more than 60 years, not since its first generation of leaders were murdered by Kakuzu the Immortal." Sakura jerked, she hadn't known that detail. Kakuzu's actions took on a sinister new import to her. Had he come back just to repeat the job? It's likely the shinobi are following Eiji just because he had authority in the old structure. Plenty of people operate that way. She shrugged. He may be deposed soon. If that happens, Waterfall will be ready for it. He gave the village's word in our agreement, not just his. Treaties tied to men are fragile, Haku said, clearly repeating someone else's words. Sakura looked back and forth between the two of them, weighing her words carefully. "So does Rain have alliances like that with other villages?" she asked. They turned towards her. No, it sounded like Rain was going to rebuild Waterfall out of pocket in exchange for military assistance. "Good ears," No said cheerfully. "But it's more a defensive alliance. If we start a war, I doubt Waterfall would follow us, which I'm sure would be a fun debate if whoever threw the first punch was in doubt." She curled a lock of blonde hair around her finger. "But the nation does have similar alliances, Sakura. It's one of the secrets to its strength, though I'm sure Konoha wouldn't have told you about that. A village relying on lesser ones for defense is unbecoming, right?" Sakura nodded, though she didn't really agree. "I came from the land of fire, you know," No said, staring off at the stars. "I know how they work, the kind of people who rise to power there." She sighed. "But enough of this. Let's rest. Plenty to do tomorrow." They did, and for the first time in weeks Sakura slept without dreams. "Even if it's not real, I feel like I belong here." ####. Sakura got back to her apartment late the next day and collapsed on her bed with a groan. AIM had welcomed them with clear skies and the city had been as active and noisome as ever. No had brought them to one of the barracks, where they'd reported on the mission and then separated. It had all been normal, just the same as it would have been back in Konoha. It made Sakura feel dissociated again, like she was looking over her own shoulder and unable to believe what she was seeing. The actions were the same, the actors were different. "You did well," was the last thing Nono had said to her, and the sincerity in it made Sakura's heart bleed. She rolled over in bed with a groan, and something at the top of it crinkled. Sakura looked back, confused and searching for the sound. She didn't see anything. She crawled up the bed, patting the blankets and looking around, and eventually hit upon the pillow. The crinkling came again, there was something under it. It was a note, a little curled up piece of paper. Sakura frowned, unrolling it with paranoid hands. The handwriting was familiar. She blinked, scanning the words. "Saw you got back. Let's meet up tonight, under that bridge near the east entrance. 10 p.m. S." Sakura blinked. How the hell had Sasuke crept into her room? How the hell had he seen her get back without her spotting him? How the hell? But then, that was just the kind of guy Sasuke was. He'd always been like that, weirdly competent and a little strange. She thought back to the entrance, trying to figure out which bridge he meant. Probably the one closest to the entrance gate, connecting two buildings. Couldn't be under the bridge leading into the city itself, that was too obvious. At 10 p.m. it would still be a little busy. They would just be another group of teenagers. They were in the same cadre anyway, right? There wouldn't be any harm in meeting up just because they hadn't been shepherded towards each other. They were shinobi. They had that independence at the very least. Sakura settled back into the pillow, looking at the letter, and grabbed a book. It seemed she had a couple hours to kill. Obito Sensei Chapter 36. The Spy and the Corpse. It was drizzling when Sakura reached the bridge, the omnipresent kind of rain that she was already learning to ignore. She tightened the collar of her poncho, feeling pleasantly chilly, and looked around. AIM was lit up at all hours of the day, and the play of neon and flame in the puddles that were gradually forming in the gutters by the sides of the road was entrancing. The street was as busy as she'd thought it would be, people of every age and means running around like it was the middle of the day. Someone had hauled a cart out to the main thoroughfare and was loudly selling mochi. Sakura thought that didn't sound half bad, even on a night that was a little cold. But she wasn't looking for dessert, she was looking for her friends, so she settled back in the shadow of the bridge, crossing her arms and trying to look as uninteresting as possible as her pink hair poked out from under her poncho's hood. People scurried by and the night dragged on to 5 minutes past 10. Sakura looked around, feeling a bit of uncertainty creep up into her chest. What if the letter had been a weird test? Had this been a trap after all? Before she could ruminate on the possibility, she saw a glint of golden hair in the crowd farther up the street, and her heart skipped a beat. When she and Naruto locked eyes, his smile lit up the whole night. He rushed forward with a laugh and looked like he was about to sweep her up in a hug before he caught himself. Sakura grinned. "Hey," she said, and Naruto just grinned back. He was wearing his new Hitai-8 like he had his old one, a traditional forward placement, and had the same old orange jacket under an equally orange poncho. Sakura had to admit that he blended right in. Even more than her now, he looked like a native. "Hey," he said back, jittering with excitement. "So you got a letter from Sasuke too?" "Yup." She settled back into the shadow of the bridge, and Naruto followed her, squatting at her side. No idea how he found me though. She was getting less looks now, she saw, having a friend made her stick out less. "Me neither," Naruto said with a shrug. "He could always do stuff like that. Maybe it's an Uchiha thing." He scratched his nose. "You been on a mission yet?" "Yeah," Sakura said, without elaborating. "You?" "Yeah," Naruto said, scrunching his face up. "But it wasn't very exciting. We just escorted some girl to the land of rivers. Barely anything happened." "Who'd you go with? Did you get the whole cadre talk?" Sakura asked. Her teammate nodded. "Yeah, I did. I was with Kabuto and that big guy, Zabuza. Kabuto was nice, like usual, he seemed really happy we were here." Naruto frowned. "But I don't know if Zabuza likes me or something. He was weird the whole time. Really like, old-fashioned, you know." He took on a stern tone. "We're here for her, not to talk. Grumpy stuff." "Huh," Sakura said. I wouldn't have thought that, from how Haku talked about him. She waved off Naruto's questioning look. Nothing much. So it was boring. Yeah. I guess that's good. It felt like any other C rank. Well, except for that one, you know. Naruto shifted on his feet, looking uncomfortable. So you haven't seen Sasuke? I figured he'd be here first. Yeah, I did too, Sakura said with a frown. But maybe he's dash. Oh hey, Naruto interrupted, and Sakura jerked her head up and away from him. Look at that. The crowd had cleared for a moment, the street falling quiet, which made the lone figure approaching them only more obvious. Sakura knew in an instant it was Sasuke. He walked with an unmistakable purpose, and his clothes were as dark as ever. He approached the two of them fearlessly, striding right up and looking them both over. Hey, he said. So you're both here, huh? He peered at Sakura with a bit of uncertainty, and she didn't know why. She cocked her head with a clear question, but Naruto was the one who spoke. Well, of course. Naruto said. Why wouldn't we be? I dunno, Sasuke said, crossing his arms. His Sharingan flashed on for just a moment, as if he was checking to make sure she was real. I was just surprised to find that letter. How'd you find my apartment, Sakura? I went looking for yours and Naruto's, but dash. Wait. The hair on the back of Sakura's neck was suddenly fully raised. Naruto shot to his feet at her side. The rain wasn't falling on them. No one on the street was paying them any attention. Sasuke, you didn't write that dash. Without warning, the street beneath them vanished, and Sakura and her friends fell. The ground ate them alive. They tumbled into the darkness, though it wasn't a long fall. Sakura slammed into the ground and spun to her feet in an instant, hand going to her knife. Naruto and Sasuke had done the same, and they all instinctively clustered up, going back to back and circling as they tried to understand what had just happened. There was a tunnel below the street. They were in the midst of it, inside a small antechamber with a short ceiling. There was light down here, but Sakura couldn't tell where it was coming from. There weren't any visible light sources. She panted, looking around and still unable to get her bearings. This place didn't look like a sewer or anything like that. It reminded her of waterfall for some reason. Earth Jutsu. It hit her suddenly. This place had been carved out with Earth Jutsu, the smooth walls, the perfect circles of the tunnel, the lack of construction. They were truly beneath rain, in the bowels of the earth. Hey, Sasuke said in a low tone, and Sakura spun at his voice. He was staring down the tunnel he'd been facing. There was someone there now, Sakura realized. It had been empty just a second before, she was sure. She didn't recognize the man. He was tall, dressed in a tan cloak, with a rain hetaite hanging from his neck and covering his throat like a metal collar. His skin was as pale as paper. Sakura's whole body was thrumming with adrenaline, and she slipped into a low pose, feeling Naruto do the same next to her as they watched the man take a step forward. She tightened her grip on her knife as Sasuke called out. Stop right there, he said, and the man did, regarding them with amused eyes. They were strange, Sakura thought, narrow and yellow. His pupil was just a slit, like a single harsh stroke of a pen. His face had the same kind of severe beauty she saw in Haku, but while in Haku it was charming, on this man it was inhuman. He looked like a carefully crafted porcelain doll. You wrote those letters. Sasuke said it with so much certainty that Sakura couldn't disbelieve him. Why do you want us here? Who are you? Wonderful questions. The shinobi's voice was silky and warm, like an expensive blanket, and it only put Sakura more on edge. And perceptive as expected. The man smiled, spreading his arms. The Hokage told you you would have a contact in a Megakure, did he not? Sakura Harano, Sasuke Uchiha. He paused, his lip twisting into a grin. Naruto Namikaze. Sakura straightened up, the tension not leaving her body. And if he did? And if he did, the man smiled without joy, then I'm your man. He made a mock bow, his eyes shining with silent laughter. Orochimaru of the Sunin, at your service. Sakura's heart skipped. One of the Sunin? One of the Sunin had defected to rain. Or faked their defection, it seemed. How had she not known this? This man was one of Jiraiya's original teammates. She was thinking too much to speak. Please, Orochimaru said, cutting down any of their words before they could form. He spun, gesturing from beneath his cloak, and made his way down the dark corridor. Follow me. ####. They walked for some time, whispering among themselves and casting suspicious looks at the Sunin. Before they arrived at their destination, Sakura would have estimated 10 minutes, but it was hard to tell down there in the dark. The tunnel grew wider and the light grew brighter until they were spat out into a large chamber, big enough to have a house in it, and with other corridors leading to more rooms beyond it. Sakura looked around and her teammates did the same, taking it in. This place had obviously been painstakingly carved out with earth jutsu, she thought, and over the course of a long time if it hadn't disturbed the city's foundations. They must have been deeper than she'd first thought. The room was filled with machines and computers, most silent but some humming with activity. There was a long line of glass tubes along one wall filled with orange liquid, and more equipment that defied her categorization. Though she'd only seen one in passing in Konoha, Sakura could only call this place a lab. Sorry that I haven't cleaned the place up, Orochimaru said. I so rarely have company down here. He gestured towards a corner of the room where some furniture had been piled, including a couch and some chairs. Feel free to take a seat, though I doubt this first meeting will be very productive. If this is something set up by the Omekage, it's pointless, Sasuke said, and Orochimaru cocked an eyebrow. Sakura admitted to being on a mission as soon as she arrived. That shouldn't matter. Of course she did, Orochimaru said with a sigh. Nagato Uzumaki is a monster. It's impossible to hide anything from him. Uzumaki? Sakura glanced over at Naruto and found that he was looking at her, eyes wide. Nagato and his mother were related? Oh, don't be so surprised, Orochimaru said, sounding bored. The clan scattered to every corner of the world after all. Sasuke ignored the jibe. Not so impossible, if you've hidden this down here. He looked around to prove the point, and Orochimaru chuckled. Well, that's a good point, but you're assuming this is hidden from the Omekage. They're aware of my little haunt down here. What? Sakura said. Orochimaru rolled his eyes. What? He mimicked, and Sakura felt herself turn red. Did you think anyone could hide from a man like Nagato? The Rinnegan essentially allows the bearer to read the minds of anyone they touch. I'm sure you felt that when you arrived, Sakura. The only way to conceal the truth is through truth. He waved his hands. And I have other measures, if necessary. He let out a sickly laugh. Partially inspired by that insipid flying thunder god. Consider it your father's contribution to this mission, Namikaze, since he clearly didn't give you much else. What? He said. Sakura was taken aback. The man had transformed from conspiratorial to cruel in the blink of an eye. Well, he was certainly stupid enough to send you here, the older man said, leaning back against a desk. There's been no sign that Itachi or the Nanabe have come to reign, but then, that tells us nothing. Even the Yondaime would know that. You got a problem with my dad? Naruto demanded, leaping off the couch, and Orochimaru laughed. I don't have a problem with your dad, he said in a mocking lilt. I have a dislike of idiots. His eyes shone. Would you call him one? Naruto. Sakura's hand shot out, catching Naruto by the sleeve before he could storm forward. She was surprised at her own decisiveness. Wait, okay. Naruto glared back at her, and she looked past him to Orochimaru. Please, I don't care if you don't like the Yondaime. That's not our business anymore. But you're our contact, you're here to help us. She stood up as well. What should I do? How am I supposed to accomplish this mission? I don't even know where to begin. I'm not a spy. You came to a foreign village to learn its secrets. Orochimaru smiled. You are already a spy purely by definition. That's not really an answer, Sakura said through gritted teeth, and the man grinned. Well, what did Namikaze tell you to do? If anything? He asked, glancing over at Sasuke as he wandered the room. His eyes were laser-focused on the Uchiha, and Sakura noticed they darted towards one of the other chambers that Sasuke was drawing closer to. Was something in there? He told me to act like I'd actually defected, Sakura said. Orochimaru shrugged. Somehow, that's good advice, he said. Sakura could hear Naruto's teeth grinding. If you want to find out the truth, you'll never manage it as a turncoat shinobi of the leaf. He pushed himself off the table. The best you could do would be to become trusted ninja of the Nation of Rain, as you've already put yourself on the path towards, Sakura. All of you must renounce your old lives, as I did. It can't be that straightforward, Sakura said, still keeping an eye on both Naruto and Sasuke. No, that's not what you're saying, Orochimaru said, amused. You're upset that I haven't given you a definite goal. He began gradually making his way towards the entrance Sasuke had approached, running his hands over the table and sweeping up a layer of dust. If that's what someone like you needs, I'll give you this. He stopped. There's only one organization in this nation that has unrestricted access to every level of power. The shinobi aren't trusted because many of them are mercenaries, spies, or traitors. The government and bureaucrats are holdovers from the country that was devoured. They are kept around for their experience, not because Rain has any affection for them. He grinned. Only the revolutionary vanguard would be trusted with the secrets of a stolen Baijuya. If you want to accomplish your mission and go home, Sakura Haruno, your goal should be joining the Akatsuki. Sakura thought that should have upset her, for some reason. The Akatsuki didn't seem easy to join. In fact, Haku and the Omekage were the only members she'd seen since arriving in the nation. Even Nono and Zabuza hadn't shown their colors. But in her heart, that had been her desire ever since she'd accepted the mission. At its heart, all Akatsuki wants is to prevent war. Okay, she said, and Naruto gave her a surprised look. I think I can do that. Wonderful, Orochimaru said. The way the word came out made it seem anything but. While you work towards that goal, your friends should likewise look to rise up the ranks. There are always opportunities in this nation, especially for ninja of their. His face twisted. Pedigree. As he spoke, still moving slowly towards Sasuke, the Uchiha poked his head curiously into the other chamber and froze. He turned back, seeing Orochimaru coming, seeing Naruto grimacing at the back of the room and Sakura still, pondering her future. Who is that? He said, gesturing with his head towards the room and locking eyes with Orochimaru. Sakura blinked, and Naruto snapped out of his fugue and stepped forward, quickly crossing the room. What? He asked. Is there someone else down here, Sasuke? There is, Orochimaru said softly. Sakura's skin crawled. Would you like to meet him? He nodded towards the room. Naruto poked his head around the corner and frowned, and Sakura was compelled to follow. Acutely aware that she was putting Orochimaru to her back, she came to Naruto's shoulder and peered into the room. It was darker and quieter there than it was in the main chamber. There were no flickering electric lights hanging from the ceiling, and no humming machines filling the air with soft background noise. It seemed mostly barren. A thick carpet covered the floor, with a large armchair placed in the center of it, and across from it, there was another, smaller chair, bare gnarled wood without even armrests. There was a man slumped in the armchair. Sakura sucked in a breath as Sasuke took a step forward towards the figure. He looked ancient and withered, long white hair covering his face and cascading down his back, but it was more than that. He was draped in a black cloak, but wherever his skin showed, on his chin, his arms, his knees, there were cracks running through his skin, like earth broken open by drought. That's impossible, Sasuke said, breaking the silence that had covered the room. Sakura stared at the seated man. He wasn't bound in any way, but he seemed stuck to the chair. If he was breathing, it was so faint she couldn't detect it. Only the occasional minute flutter of his hands or the shifting of his long white hair betrayed any life at all. I've seen pictures of this guy before, he said, turning back towards Orochimaru. The Sunin favored him with a nasty smile. But he's dead. Very, Orochimaru said, striding forward and shaking the man by the shoulder, once, violently. The ancient man started, letting out a frightened cry and looking around. He didn't have any eyes, Sakura saw immediately, just two empty sockets. He started muttering under his breath, a constant stream of slurred words that held no meaning. Sakura felt her stomach twist. It reminded her of her great uncle, who hadn't even recognized her by the time he'd passed away. Then how can he be here? Sasuke said, taking a step back. He looked scared, Sakura saw, which was exactly how she felt. She didn't understand what she was seeing, but she knew it was wrong. How can Madara Uchiha be here? Well, that's very simple, Orochimaru said. I brought him back. You're lying, Naruto interjected as Sasuke withdrew into himself, staring at the ancient muttering man in the corner. You can't bring dead people back. That's stupid. Orochimaru laughed. It's funny, Namikaze. Did you know your father stole his Hiraishin from the second Hokage? He gestured at the talking corpse. Sakura couldn't speak, the implications were too overwhelming for her. This was one of the Nidame's jutsu as well. We were in competition for the position of the Yondaime, Minato, and I, and we both decided that the best way to achieve it was to improve on the jutsu of our predecessors. His laugh twisted into a snarl. But the second's Edo Tensei required human sacrifice, while his improved Hiraishin would only kill thousands in the blink of an eye. The third Hokage, my own sensei, said much the same thing as you, though with longer words. He crossed his arms, glaring at Naruto. How amusing that a foolish old man and a stupid young boy should have the same opinion. It seems your blinders transcend generations. He was killed by the first Hokage, Sakura finally said. She couldn't shake the feeling they were in danger. Were they allowed to know this? Orochimaru had just let Sasuke wander into this room, so it seemed to be the case, but reanimating the dead definitely seemed like something that should be hidden. Did Konoha have his body? Do the Omekage know? Do they approve? No, Orochimaru said, giving her a curious look. She hadn't objected, she realized, just asked questions. I found his corpse in the land of water, tucked away in a hidden cave. It seems that his death at the Shodame's hands was overstated. He smiled. Not that it helped him. I brought him back to answer my questions. The Sharingan has always fascinated me, and the genesis of the villages as well. He gestured to the trembling man. I keep him at the moment of his death, alone, confused, too frail to do anything but speak. It's funny, isn't it? Even the mighty Madara Uchiha was rendered helpless by age. Whatever he was hoping to accomplish in that cave went to waste. This is torture, Sasuke said, stepping closer to his ancestor. The man was still mumbling, his hands shaking in his lap. He doesn't deserve this. He was a traitor to the village who tried to murder the first Hokage, Orochimaru said slyly. Surely, as traitors yourselves, you understand that there's nothing that would not be condoned against a man like that. And besides, it's gratifying to have one of the men who founded the Hidden Leaf here at my whim, relieving the last moments of his regret-filled life. I don't think I'll ever tire of it. Sakura felt she was starting to gain an understanding of him. This was a man who delighted in showing how clever he was, she thought. But if he'd been in Rain and was trusted enough by the Hokage to be their contact despite some obvious personal animosity, he might actually be smart enough to back that up. He was telling them this for a reason. You. The man croaked, and everyone in the room, even Orochimaru, jumped at the clarity of his voice. He was leaning forward towards Sasuke, empty sockets wide. Sasuke just stared at the zombie, face twisted in disgust. The man's cracked hands came up as if to cradle Sasuke's cheeks, shaking violently the whole way. I know you. He groaned. Izuna. I lost my shadow, how stupid can an old man be? That's enough of that, Orochimaru said. He raised his hand, 2 fingers extended in a ram seal, and Madara stiffened, his jaw going slack. Some dust drifted from his mouth as he stared straight ahead, inanimate. Let him go. Sasuke spun around, his eyes wide. He was scared. Let him die. He launched himself at Orochimaru, and Sakura found herself following without a thought. The man laughed and spun back, slipping past Naruto and jabbing a finger into his forehead as he went. Naruto stumbled back, rubbing at his head in confusion. Sasuke went in, his Sharingan flashing, and the older man made the same jabbing motion. His finger grotesquely extended, shooting out more than 5 feet and slamming into Sasuke's forehead, and Sakura's teammate was thrown back into the wall, head lolling. "Wait!" she shouted out as Naruto collapsed. "Don't dash!" An edifying meeting, Orochimaru said, suddenly behind her. Too fast for her to do a thing. She spun, the knife coming up. His fingers slammed into her forehead, and the world began spinning, melting, and slipping away. Sakura stumbled, feeling foreign chakra burning into her brain, and collapsed to one knee. She looked up at the sun, her vision swimming as anger boiled her heart. "I look forward to our next one," he said, and then the world was buried in darkness. ####. Sakura woke up in her bed and looked around. She was hyperventilating. Had she been having a nightmare? It was dark outside, the walls of the buildings beyond her window dancing with neon lights. The digital clock on her nightstand read 1:26. She sat up, rubbing her eyes. It was strange, she was usually a solid sleeper. It felt like there was something stuck in her head, swimming behind her eye like the beginning of a headache. She didn't even remember getting into bed. She'd gotten home from the mission, she'd been exhausted, she'd seen Sasuke and Naruto, she thought. She'd gotten a letter to see them. They'd met up at the Eastern Bridge. They'd gotten a late dinner. They'd agreed to meet again, as soon as possible. It had been really nice. She'd felt like she completely belonged again. Sakura sat back, her eyes slipping closed as the rain outside lured her back to sleep. Nothing to worry about it, she thought, the notion slipping through her mind like molasses. She just needed to be loyal, she just needed to be strong. Everything else would work itself out. Obito Sensei Chapter 37. Erosion. By the end of the first month, Team 7's time in Omegakuer was beginning to feel real. That was about how long it took for the verisimilitude of their old lives to fade. A big part of it was that for Naruto and Sakura, their lives had not changed that much. Both of them had been mostly independent before leaving Konoha. They had spent time with their parents, but never entirely relied on them, and knew how to account for themselves in everything from managing their money to cleaning up their rooms. It took Naruto a week to remember that the floor wouldn't automatically eat his garbage, but he adapted relatively quickly after that. Sasuke had a harder time of it. He missed his clan and sometimes late at night, though he would never admit it, his mother. He wondered how she was doing, whether she had been executed. He slept without blankets because of the way the fear made his body burn. As they learned from each other, all of Team 7 had similar apartments spread out across the city. Single-room suites with an attached bathroom, all with a balcony, though Sasuke's had by far the best view. They all wondered why that was, but eventually decided it was down to random chance. Sasuke wasn't given unique treatment in any other way, and a nice view was too petty a concession if that was the actual goal. By the end of the second month, Team 7 was beginning to internalize that they didn't know when they would be going home. Before then it had been something they understood, because it was obvious, but had not felt in their heart. They had another meeting with Orochimaru of the Sunin in that time, another meeting they did not remember. When they discussed it, they all agreed they had the sensation of having linked up with Konoha's agent within the nation, but none of the details. Whoever it was watching and guiding them, they decided, but was keeping them from knowing the truth. Why, they had no idea. Like all children who travel to a new place, they began to make new friends after an initial period of friction and resistance. Sakura was already on good terms with Haku and Nono thanks to the success of her first mission, but she quickly grew more familiar with the other members of their cadre. They took missions together, none so dramatic as the first, and got to know one another. Zabuza Momokai was much as Naruto and Sasuke had described him, a huge and gruff man who approached everything with a passive animosity, like he expected even simple conversations to end with violence. Haku told Sakura after their second mission together that Zabuza had grown up in the Bloody Mist, and that he had slaughtered his entire graduating class to prove himself worthy of becoming a ninja. After that, Sakura had been somewhat scared of the man. What kind of person could kill that many people just to become a ninja? She couldn't help but feel that it further opened her eyes. Konoha and Rain were standouts among the other villages, she thought. Mist was a slaughterhouse just a generation ago, Stone was Konoha's perennial rival, Sand was led by a Kazekage who turned his own son into a murderer and thought nothing of it, and she was sure the hidden cloud was no better. Only the villages led by the men who'd followed Jiraiya's vision were doing anything to justify their existence. It was an extreme thought, but Sakura didn't question it. She had to be trusted to succeed, and Rain was a nation of extremists. She could and would fit right in. The other members of the cadre did not inspire the same thoughts in her, with one exception. Kabuto was friendly and passive, Suijutsu harsh and bold. They were good fits for Naruto and Sasuke. Kabuto had the patience to handle Naruto's energy and Suijutsu the confidence to challenge Sasuke's casual superiority. Sakura had interest in them as teammates, but found that she couldn't spend too much time with them without chafing. Kabuto was too friendly, to the point where she never felt she could trust him. The older boy always paid for meals, always held the door, always defused any potentially offensive joke with a light laugh. He wasn't like his mother Nono, who Sakura had to admire for her constant confidence. It was like he had been trained to always hedge his bets and make friends everywhere he went, and Sakura couldn't reciprocate that sincere insincerity. Suijutsu was just the opposite, naturally. He was rude, which did not play well with Sakura's newfound temper since she had let it speak more and more honestly since defecting. The first time she obliterated his head with a punch and shook out her wet fist, Sakura had realized that she could work with the boy made of water, but didn't want to spend time with him. Sasuke got along with him, and that was just fine. The boys made a habit of puncturing each other's egos, a natural kinship that Sakura didn't understand and also didn't need to. It was good for Sasuke to have another friend besides Naruto, even if it was a weird boy friendship that looked more like violent competition. He needed a reason to stay here. They all did. Past all that, Karen was the odd one out. The first time Naruto had met her, he'd done a double take, and Sakura couldn't blame him. Karen was short and meek, with red-rimmed glasses that further drew out her eyes and hair. They were deep red, almost the same color as Kushina's. She was an Uzumaki, it eventually came out. Like Nagato, though Sakura couldn't remember exactly how she knew that. She was one of the many refugees who had come to the Nation of Rain over the years, though no one was sure when or how. In some way, she was distantly related to Naruto through his mother. That had been all Naruto needed, apparently. She'd been a friend within the week and a sister within the month. He'd brought Karen out of her shell with his earnestness, and as usual without even trying. The same way he'd done for her, Sakura sometimes thought, feeling a sting of what might be jealousy. But Naruto had defected for her, Karen was just a member of his mother's scattered clan. It wasn't a rational feeling. Which didn't stop her from having it. They went on missions over those 2 months, almost always in different team compositions of 3, though Team 7 couldn't help but notice that it was never just the 3 of them. That was just common sense, even if they were trusted. Another detail that could not be overlooked was that of the dozen missions they were sent on, none of them involved the Hidden Leaf in any capacity. Rain and the Omekage did not want them to make some grand statement of their loyalty, Sasuke said one night as they had teriyaki at a new restaurant Sakura had discovered in the basement of a ninja tools shop, and Naruto had nodded in agreement with a mouth full of food. Them defecting had been more than enough, forcing them to work in opposition to the Leaf would just be stupid and pushing their luck. That was how it went, day by day and week by week. Team 7 made new friends, found new places, created new habits. It's not that much different from Konoha, they said to each other, except that it was a lot damper. Sakura discovered a taste for fried fish that she hadn't appreciated back in Konoha, Sasuke improved his ninjutsu with competition after competition, and Naruto eventually gathered the courage to approach both Yakushis about their spectacular medical jutsu. He didn't want his friends getting hurt, he said, and if they did he wanted to be able to fix them. They all missed their homes, their families, their friends, and their sensei. That couldn't be avoided. But it could definitely be worse. ####. Sakura sat back and chewed thoughtfully as Naruto gave her a pleading look. It's really that hard? She asked, and he nodded. She was trying out a new salmon strip, and it was fantastic. The good food made Naruto's despair a little more amusing. You know I've never been crazy with chakra control, Sakura. That's your thing, he whined. On Sakura's other side, Sasuke rolled his eyes. You mastered the Raise Non, didn't you?" he said. Naruto huffed. They were having dinner at Sakanaya, the restaurant that Sakura had grown to adore. The wooden floor was always shiny and spotless, the seats were wide and comfortable, and there was a counter where you could sit and eat as you watched the chef, an older woman named Miyo, prepare the meals. That's where they were, shoulder to shoulder as they gulped down their food. That was different. It's like being able to pat your belly and rub your head at the same time," he said, demonstrating on himself. Sakura giggled. "Like it's hard at first but eventually it's just muscle memory, so you forget how to, not do it. But this kinda stuff will be the exact same," Sakura said. Naruto gave her a doubtful look. "How long were you working on the Rasengan anyway, Naruto?" "A couple months." Naruto started counting on his fingers. "Like 5 months? Almost 6, I guess." He blinked. "Geez, yeah. Dad gave me my first balloon after Obito's bell test." "Bell test?" Sakura shifted, looking past Naruto, and Karen blinked back at her. The other Uzumaki had joined them for dinner, but hadn't ordered much beyond soup. Sakura didn't really get the appeal of fish soup. Wouldn't you miss out on all the textures then? What was that? Oh. Naruto turned back towards her, chopsticks almost going flying. That was the test we did to see if we'd make genin after we graduated. It was an old thing apparently, my dad went through the same one, and he put Obito through it too, and then he did it for us. He laughed. But he changed the rules up. The way I heard it, the original test was about taking the bells from your teacher. You know, to prove you could work together against someone stronger than you. Karen was nodding along with a serious expression. Sakura just picked at her food. It felt weird for them to share personal details of Konoha's history like that, she thought, and it was without a doubt Konoha's history. But if they'd abandoned the village, why would they treat it with any special consideration? Naruto was even better at being a defector than her, maybe because he didn't spend so much time thinking about it. But Obito reversed it. He gave each of us a bell to protect from him, and then kicked our asses. Sasuke let out a chuckle, and Sakura couldn't help but echo him. Actually, Sasuke and I both totally lost. Naruto turned back to her with a smile, and as ever, Sakura's heart jumped. We only won cause of Sakura. You beat Mangekyo no Obito? Karen asked, eyes wide behind her glasses, and Sakura snorted. Hell no, she said. I was scared out of my mind, so I did the only thing I could think of. She took another bite of salmon to illustrate the point. I ate it. You ate it? Karen blinked. She ate it, Sasuke confirmed. What was he going to do, rip her guts out? Obito isn't that sort of guy. Karen grimaced. It's weird, the way you guys talk about him, she said. From what I've heard of him, he seems like the kind of person who definitely would do that. But you three, he was your teacher, and you make him sound like a normal guy. And a good teacher. She glanced between the three of them. A great one, actually. He is. Was, Naruto said. Then why'd you leave him? Karen asked, and Sakura cocked her head at the suddenly precise question. The girl didn't look devious, just curious. I'm sure you all had your own reasons, but if you had someone like that in Konoha, I guess I just can't understand leaving someone like that behind. She had never had someone like that, Sakura immediately realized. Karen had been a refugee and an orphan all her life. What, was she stupid? Why hadn't she seen that right away? Sasuke spoke first. Obito's a great guy, he said carefully. But because of his reputation, and how important he is to the village, he had a lot of responsibilities. Things he couldn't do, no matter what. And that made it so he couldn't. He frowned. Couldn't give us what we needed, I guess. I'm sorry, Karen said. I didn't mean to dash. It's fine. Naruto waved her off. He was a great sensei, like Sasuke said. It wasn't his fault things turned out like they did. Did you think about asking him to come with you? Karen asked, and Sakura shook her head. Never, she said, and Karen pursed her lips. Obito Sensei never tried to make us, not question the village, I guess, but he also wasn't the kind of ninja who would. The hidden leaf gave him everything, he couldn't afford to challenge it. Karen went quiet, and they all ate the rest of their meal in silence. Don't think we forgot about your whining, Sakura said when she was finished with her strips, catching Naruto with a mouthful of rice. Why'd you bother asking Kabuto about medical ninjutsu if you didn't think you could do it? Cause I thought I could do it, Naruto said with a cocky grin, and Sakura grinned back. Whining is part of my process, you know. Well, careful about it, Sakura said slyly. Nono might test you with something freaky, she seems like the kind of person to do that. It'll be fine. Naruto shrugged. Kabuto's just got me trying to separate water and milk now. Like, to get a sense for that sort of control. Gross. Seems like a waste of milk. Well, I get to drink it if I separate it out. Naruto stuck out his tongue. So it tastes like shit when I mess up, he said with a laugh. At least you'll be able to fix us up when you're finished, Sasuke said, before giving a mean smile. If you finish? Hey, water you dash. Naruto started to jibe back, and then he paused. Sakura noticed it too, the idle chatter of the other customers in the building had gone silent. She twisted her head and looked over her shoulder towards the entrance, trying to see what had drawn their attention. It was immediately obvious, there was a man standing in the doorway, tall and pale, covered in a thin red and black Akatsuki cloak. He had long white hair, all the way past his shoulders, and 2 red dots on his brow, almost like a second pair of eyes. He was scanning the restaurant, and when Sakura turned, his unerring gaze settled on her without a change in expression. He stepped forward, and conversation uncertainty resumed as he silently made his way across the wood. The staff did not shout their welcome, it seemed they were just as unsettled as everyone else. Hey, Naruto said, elbowing Karen as the man walked towards them. Who's that? Kimimaro Kagaya, she whispered, like saying his name out loud would be profane. One of the Akatsuki's commanders. A commander? Sakura knew the Akatsuki was outside of the normal chain of command in the nation, but nothing about its internal makeup. Just one more piece of information important enough to note, but not important enough to have sought out. She spun around in her chair as Kimimaro drew up before them, his eerie gaze sweeping across all 4 of them. Sakura Harano, he said, and she straightened up. Everyone was looking at her now, even her teammates. Your presence is requested. Requested, not required, but Sakura didn't care to question why. She glanced at Sasuke. You want me to dash? He gestured easily. I'll pay. Go on, seems important. She nodded in thanks and hopped off her stool, giving her jacket a perfunctory dusting. Of course, she said with a slight bow, and Kimimaro inclined his head back. Lead the way. He turned, every movement precise and mechanical, and strode out of the building with the clear expectation she'd follow. Sakura had to scramble to keep up with him, leaving her friends behind and pulling her hood up as she moved out into the thick wet air of a megakure. It was a very wet evening, the clouds were very angry today, as some of the locals would say. Kimimaro set a fast pace, moving from a quick walk to a jog to an outright run as they drew away from the restaurant, leading Sakura through several alleys, past a thoroughfare, and then straight up a building. She drew alongside him, putting in some effort but trying not to show it, and flinched as a particularly thick raindrop hit her right in the eye. Who's requested me, sir? She asked. Who else? He didn't even glance back. The Omekage wished to speak to you. What for? Kicking you out already. Sakura stomped down on her fear. It had been more than 2 months now, and she'd been nothing but a model shinobi. She was just being stupid. Do you know what for? She asked. Kimimaro shook his head once. I do not. He looked back at her, his eyes still flat. They were near the top of the first building, but he was changing his trajectory a little, and a moment later they leapt across the gap from one to another, landing on a leering demon's face and continuing upwards. They were drawing close to the center of the village, Sakura was pretty sure. Are you concerned? I'm nervous, Sakura admitted freely, and the man nodded. How old was he anyway? He had a face like he was 40, but Sakura was starting to suspect he was less than half that, only a couple years older than her. "That's good," he said. "It means you're not a fool, after all." Sakura didn't know how to respond to that, so she didn't, and they cut a path through the rain for another couple minutes. It was as she had suspected. They were heading for the Omekage Tower at the center of the village, a towering obelisk of black metal that they'd inherited from Hanzo the Salamander. That story was common enough that she'd heard it 20 times over. Kimimaro came to a stop on a balcony about halfway up the tower, and courteously opened the wide door there for her, bringing them both in from the rain. When Sakura thanked him, he didn't respond, just regarded her with those flat teal eyes. He strode ahead, down a hall and up some stairs. Another flight, a third, and down another hall. The whole tower was a three-dimensional maze, and Sakura quickly lost track of her original direction. The walls of the halls were covered in tapestries and designs of the elements, legends, angels, and gods. It was dizzying to look at, to consider all the work that had gone into creating art that was meant to be walked by. "Here," Kimimaro eventually said, gesturing to another grand double door made of a dark wood. He soundlessly pushed it open, revealing a smaller room on the other side. Sakura stepped in, and he spoke. "Sakura Harano, as requested," was all he said, and then the door closed behind her with a muffled click. The room was small, maybe the size of Sakura's apartment, with a thick purple carpet and wood panel walls perfect for absorbing noise. There were circular black chairs lining the walls and a short table made of stainless steel in the center, upon which was set a go board. Sakura didn't need to be an expert to see that it was a masterfully handcrafted board, the kind that probably cost thousands of ryo. There were 3 people in the room, and they turned to watch her as she entered. All were seated, 2 on either side of the board and 1 on one of the chairs circling the room. In the chair was Konan, dressed in a casual black dress that revealed her shoulders and the edge of her navel. Small red clouds were worked into it, dappling her skirt. She was leaning forward, engrossed in the game, but her face twitched into a smile when she saw Sakura walk in. Yahiko was there as well, one half of the game. With tan pants and a black t-shirt, he looked like a shinobi on his day off, which he may well have been. He was frowning, hand on his chin as he surveyed the board. Sakura didn't know much about Go besides the very basics of the rules, but she was pretty sure he was playing black, and that he was losing. It wasn't Nagato on the other side of the board. It was Jiraiya, and Sakura flinched as he looked up at her from the game, lone eye narrowed. "So," he said, "you really did run away, huh?" She wasn't ready for this. She felt her heart speed up in an instant. "Sakura," Konan said before she could respond. "Take a seat, will you?" Not knowing what else to do, Sakura did, trudging over to one of the chairs a quarter of the room away from Konan, at Yahiko's back. She wasn't bold enough to sit right next to the Omekage. "Oh, not there," Konan said, patting the chair at her side, and Sakura swallowed. Konan was centered between the 2 men at the room's side. A neutral position that also put her in both their peripheral vision. She slid into the chair feeling an intruder, and as she sat down Yahiko threw his arms up. "Well, I'm screwed," he said, and Jiraiya smirked. "Another?" "Sure," the older man said, resetting his side of the board. The whole thing was left clean. Sakura knew how to play shogi, but all she knew about Go was that it was an entirely different beast. As Yahiko and Jiraiya both began moving, she understood why. Go started with a blank slate. As they placed their stones, black and white, strategic positions took place. The 2 men forming the kind of battlefield shogi was fought across with their own placements. "While we're at it, you can tell me what you were hoping to accomplish bringing her here." "It wasn't to throw you off," Yahiko said. His moves were quick but deliberate, clack clack clack. His teacher was slower, placing stones ponderously, but Sakura could see he was focused on defense and offense in equal measure. Go was a game where you had to beat your opponent decisively, but Jiraiya's approach was passive and patient. "I thought you might want to meet her. I'm sure you know that her teammates are here as well." "Minato was furious," Jiraiya said, sweeping up one of Yahiko's strongholds. Sakura blinked. She hadn't even seen how Jiraiya had set up such a strong offense, and apparently neither had Yahiko. "Not that I can blame him. It was certainly rude of his son to up and abandon the leaf like that." and perhaps indicative of a deeper problem? Yahiko asked innocently. Jiraiya snorted. That's cute, he said. But I wouldn't take the actions of teenagers as an unquestionable truth. Besides, Sakura left to spy on you guys, right? Naruto was just dragged along. Sakura stiffened, and Konan nodded at her side. So she admitted. But you of all people should know that she came for her own reasons as well, sensei. Oh. Jiraiya said. Clack, clack, clack. He turned towards Sakura, fixing her with his single dark eye. Well? Is that the case, Sakura? Sakura wet her lips, trying to think of what to do and defaulting to honesty for lack of a better option. After Waterfall, when you were talking to us about Ninshu, she said, and Konan raised an eyebrow, you said that the Akatsuki you killed Danzo for was gone. But after what Haku had told me about the Akatsuki, what it stood for, I wanted to see if that was true. Jiraiya said, and Sakura noticed Yahiko was pressing in on him. There seemed to be more black than white. Well, that was fair of you, I suppose. It was. Sakura couldn't keep the surprise out of her tone, and Jiraiya rolled his eye. I am a bitter old man with many enemies and many regrets, he said dramatically. You'd be stupid to trust me without reservation, wouldn't you? You told them about Ninshu, huh? Yahiko said. That explains their attitude. It felt like they already knew a little something about the world. They could fake that easily, Jiraiya said dismissively. Then I'm sure you also told her that you think the nation has become just another village, Yahiko said, and Jiraiya nodded, clearly bored. Sakura could tell this was an old topic between the two men. Well, do you think that's true, Sakura? Konan asked. She glanced at the woman, pursing her lips. Oh, don't interrogate her, Jiraiya griped. She's already in an impossible situation. It wouldn't be fair. Well, that is part of why we invited her here, Yahiko said. Jiraiya shook his head. An invitation can be refused. I doubt she felt like that was a possibility. You sent one of your Akatsuki for her, right? She probably felt it was critical. He sighed. I don't mind you forcing us together, Yahiko, but please don't act like she had a choice in the matter. He gestured, arms wide. This whole village is like that now, cloaked in false choices. It's why I come for these meetings, even if we never agree during them. Yahiko frowned, and Sakura couldn't tell if it was anger or remorse on his face. My apologies, sensei. That's all right, Jiraiya said. He was dominating the board again. So, what were you intending? Sakura is a wonderful ninja, Konan said. Sakura felt like a bug under a microscope, but Konan smiled warmly at her. She's already done Rain enormous service, even if she's only been here for a couple months. Waterfall has agreed to a defensive alliance thanks to her. We thought there could be some value in the two of you meeting. Oh? Still wrapping up those minor villages. Jiraiya shifted. I was wondering if that was what Waterfall was about. His face hardened. You put that whole thing together, huh? Not in the way you're thinking, Yahiko said, his smile fading. But you can't tell me more because the uncertainty of the other villages is critical to you now, Jiraiya said, his tone cruel. This is what I mean, Yahiko. He sat back, abandoning a game he was about to win. The nation you've created is no different from any other hidden village. The nation isn't in service to anyone, Yahiko said, crossing his arms. That independence is key to Dash. You don't have any independence. Jiraiya laughed. Sakura fidgeted, feeling very much out of place. None that matters. That's ridiculous, Yahiko said, growing a little colder. Konan leaned back, watching both men patiently, and Sakura tried to take some comfort from her calm. She could feel the furnace in her heart heating up. We are our own masters here in Rain, no daimyo to answer to, no government encouraging war with our neighbors for land or resources. He raised 3 fingers. You told us yourself many times, money, fear, and hatred are the things that perpetuated the world wars. All those things are driven by the government. And you've become the government. You've said it yourself. Jiraiya shook his head in obvious disgust. The problem is not an outsider creating those circumstances, Yahiko. Any human will manage it just fine all by themselves. You can say the nation is independent, but it is still a part of the system of shinobi and villages, and by participating, it spreads those triggers. He patted the carpet. Look around at what you've made. Rain is full of wealth, which inspires both ambition and jealousy. It's amassing the loyalty of minor villages, with Waterfall only being the latest. And it is taking brilliant young boys and girls like Sakura here, he pointed at Sakura, who blushed, for its own, away from their families and homes, so that they can pursue its goals. That creates hatred. The nation is exactly what you created it to surpass. It's a work in progress, Konan said, cutting off Yahiko before he could continue. His face was going red. Jiraiya gave her a contemptuous look, and she returned an unimpressed one. Sensei, it's the problem of ninjutsu that you first espoused to us. When one group masters ninjutsu, it becomes necessary for others to take it up as well, lest they have no defense against it. You can call it evolutionary pressure, or gravity, or some other fundamental force if you want, but any new nation that has been created in the last 50 years has taken the form of a hidden village, because they are the most stable structures. Not Desh, Jiraiya said. Konan shook her head, speaking quickly. Not stable, you're right. Successful, she corrected herself. Systems upheld by shinobi have been proven the most successful. If rain hadn't been, it would just have been overrun, as it nearly was, before you saved us. That, I'm more sympathetic to, Jiraiya said, leaving Yahiko to stew. But then the question becomes, how do you plan to have rain evolve beyond yet another hidden village? By coalition, Sakura blurted out. All the adults in the room looked at her, and she fought the urge to shrink into herself. Right? That's why you're making alliances with minor villages like Waterfall. That could be part of it. She felt a thrill as she realized that Jiraiya was addressing her directly. But plenty of hidden villages have alliances with one another. They've never paved the way to peace before. The hidden sand and leaf are allies at the moment, but I doubt you think of them that way, Sakura. No, she had to concede. To tell the truth, she was more frightened of sand, and Gaara, than any other village. But there could be other parts of it, right? Like. She stopped, suddenly unsure if she even had a place to speak here, but Jiraiya made an obvious, get on with it, motion with his hand. The nation is filled with shinobi from other villages. Me, and Naruto, and Sasuke of course, but there are ninja here from every major village, from every country. She looked over to Konan. Which I don't think has ever been done. No, Konan said with a smile. That is unique to Rain. But that diversity is considered proof of Rain's treachery, Jiraiya pointed out. Some of whom you call refugees, other countries and villages call criminals or traitors. He paused. That said, I see where you're coming from, Sakura. If Rain can become a melting pot of other nations, it can also have a unique advantage in bringing them together. Sure, Sakura said, trying to pretend that was definitely what she'd been thinking. I've said that. Yahiko grumbled, and Jiraiya shushed him. You've said it in a stupid way, he said, and Konan giggled. You always were a kid with an eye for world domination, Yahiko, it flavors everything you say. Hey, it's a peaceful sort of domination, Yahiko said guilelessly. Violence and hatred just don't work for that kind of thing, he continued with a laugh. Even if Rain did conquer the world, we'd eventually just get conquered in turn, and then everything would be even more fucked up than before. He sobered up. You know me, Sensei. You know all of us. We don't want a war. Everything we're doing to keep one from happening. Like nabbing a Baijuya. Jiraiya said shortly. Yahiko's face went flat. Sakura held her breath. She wouldn't have been sent if Jiraiya could just ask that question and get away with it, and Yahiko proved her right a moment later. If we did that, he said quietly, it would be pretty unacceptable. He glanced up at Jiraiya, his head low, and moved one of his pieces into a weak position in the corner of the board, still unclaimed. We can only hope the Nanabi shows up again soon, to settle this one way or another. Humph. Jiraiya seized his stones, and the game was over in his favor within 40 seconds. Have you considered the principle of KO? What? Yahiko asked as he cleared his side of the board. Did I mess that up again? I was trying not to do it. Not in the game, Jiraiya said, sounding tired. In your nation. KO. Sakura quietly asked Konan as the men continued, and she bent in, her hair brushing Sakura's shoulder. A rule and go, she said. You can't reoccupy a space that was just captured, it's to prevent repeated moves. She made a little motion with both her index fingers, one finger trapping the other and then getting trapped in turn over and over, and Sakura understood. With Go having so many angles of play, there had to be a rule to keep the same space from being traded back and forth forever. The villages don't have a concept of KO, Jiraiya said, and Yahiko tilted his head. That's why this story keeps getting repeated, no one knows how to let something lie. No one should, Yahiko said with a quizzical look. It's fine to accept your loss in a game, but in reality? If you can try to fix your mistake. But it never ends up being that, Jiraiya said. It ends up being about revenge, about inflicting as much loss as you suffered. That's why this country was pounded into mud, Yahiko. And we're fixing that now. Yahiko waved his arms. If the villages had KO, then rain would just have stayed empty and broken. It's not a good metaphor, Sensei. Probably not, Jiraiya sighed. There aren't any good metaphors for something like this. I'm trying to say that if you did take the Nanabe, then you're making the same mistake of assuming rain needs to have the strengths of the other villages to succeed. And if you didn't? He turned over one of the white stones in his hand, delicately slipping it between his fingers. Then a truly deranged man has a Baijuyu all to himself, and tried to pin the blame all on you. He placed the stone in a silk bag at the table's side. Because he knew he'd be believed, because rain has made itself appear desperate for any kind of power. It's an honest desperation, Konan said, sitting up straight. Even if you don't agree with us, Jiraiya-sensei, I think you won't regret training us. I never regret training you, Jiraiya said. He stood up, and everyone, including Sakura, followed him to their feet. You've all become incredible ninja. It was clearly something you were born to do. He paused. How is Nagato doing? Well. Busy, as ever, Yahiko said, and Jiraiya grinned. I'm sure. He's always had a lot on his plate. He glanced at Sakura. Does she know how important he is? I don't know, Yahiko mused. Do you know how important Nagato is, Sakura? She took a deep breath. I know he has the Rinnegan. The Hokage told me about it before I left. She shrugged. But aside from that, I don't really know much about it, or him. Or any of you, she said. I don't know why I'm here. I don't think I know enough to really contribute to the conversation. It's not a conversation you need to know everything about to be a part of, Konan said. Jiraiya nodded in agreement. There's no set answer, not yet. Even what you said today is a building block of what will help us build towards a solution. Sakura gave them all a doubtful look, a distant conversation sparking her memory. The Hokage told me that the last person who had the Rinnegan decided the course of the world. Do you all think Nagato will be the same? Absolutely, Yahiko and Jiraiya said at the same time, and Konan smirked. Yahiko gracefully ceded the floor with a deferential wave of his hands, and Jiraiya rolled his eyes. When you all talk about the nation changing the game, stopping the system of shinobi that's caused all this suffering, Nagato is always going to be the linchpin of that, whether he wants to or not. He gave Sakura a serious look. The sage of the 6 paths that I told you about, Sakura, the man who invented ninju, he was the first and last human to possess the Rinnegan, until now. Do you understand what I mean? The revelation shot through her like lightning. The Rinnegan had belonged to the person who had created the circumstances that led to the shinobi system millennia ago, and now it had reappeared within a group of people who were determined to end it. Sakura suppressed a shiver and nodded, and Jiraiya smiled. Well, if you get that, you'll probably go far here, he said, looking around. Though I'll make a hypocrite of myself, I think. What do you mean, sir? She asked, and he shrugged. Now that you've left one village for another, you'll have a more unique perspective on this question, Jiraiya said. I've tried to get a straight answer out of both my teammates, but they haven't been helpful. What's the question? Sakura asked, and she saw Yahiko roll his eyes. I think I have an idea, he muttered. Jiraiya laughed. You'd say loyalty is important, right? He asked. Was he implying something? Sakura took a minute to look like she was considering the question, furrowing her brow, but she was more concerned with whatever Jiraiya was implying. She didn't want to lose his respect, she realized, if she'd ever had it in the first place. She was overthinking it. Of course, she eventually said. You can't have any sort of organization without loyalty in it. If people don't trust each other, they can't work together to do anything. Naturally, Jiraiya said. But when you say, loyalty in it. Notice that phrasing? What exactly does that mean? Well, it depends what it is, Sakura said, answering from her gut this time. Like if it's a society, or a village, you're loyal to that in that you obey it and don't undermine it. If it's a person, you have their back and support them. If it's a religion, you follow its tenets, and you have to be loyal to the other people that are a part of whatever it is you're loyal to as well, cause they all represent a piece of it. Close, but you're not going deeper, Jiraiya said. Sakura paused and glanced at Konan, and the older woman shrugged. She was either ignorant or good at feigning it. What I'm curious about, Sakura, is whether you think you should be loyal to ideals, or to reality. Sakura paused, blinked. The room was still, but not stifling, the Omekage were leaning in, waiting for her answer as well. She couldn't understand how she'd become the center of attention. Because I came here, she said. Jiraiya grinned and nodded. Because you came here, he repeated. You said that it was to find out for yourself if the Akatsuki that Haku had told you about was real. That tells me that you agree with that message, that conflict is a waste, and that shinobi should be humans, not tools of a larger entity. And naturally, that means you had some discontent with Konoha, which decided to use you as a tool. You felt you might not be able to be loyal to a village like that. He crossed his arms. But if you're loyal to ideals and reality doesn't meet them, where will you go next, huh? Sakura swallowed her fear and said something stupid. I'd have to make them real, she said. Jiraiya cocked an eyebrow. If the world let me down, if the Akatsuki let me down, I would just have to make it what it should be. The sound of her heart beating was deafening, with the Sunin and two of the village's leaders staring at her. Maybe I should have done that in Konoha, but I didn't think I could. I wasn't brave enough to. I think the Akatsuki is closer to my ideals, or the ideals I want to have, and that's why I chose them. Jiraiya didn't speak for a moment, no one did. Eventually, Yahiko broke the silence. Damn. He laughed, and the other adults laughed with him. Sakura started, afraid she'd gone too far. She got you, old man. Shut up, Jiraiya grumbled good-naturedly. Most of the people you have around here are just mooks, you know. Some of them, yes, Konan said with gentle humor. But Sakura is not someone who came here because she had no other choice. She could have become an elite shinobi in Konoha under Mangekyo no Obito. She left because she was a believer, even if she was given permission to. She gave Sakura a warm smile, and Sakura shyly returned it. And she's right to say what she did, after all, it's people like her who will change the world. Jiraiya didn't sound too sure about that. He stood up from the table with a dismissive wave. We should continue this another time, I think. I'll stay a little longer, if that's all right with you two. You're always welcome here, Sensei, Konan said. The nation is Rain is your home as much as it is ours, even if you don't approve of it. It appreciates you more than the hidden leaf, that's for sure. Heh. Sakura couldn't tell what was held in Jiraiya's quiet laugh. I guess so. He made his way to the door, and then turned back. Thanks for the answer, Sakura. What did your teammates say? She asked suddenly, and Jiraiya paused, his hand on the door frame. You meant Orochimaru and Tsunade of the Sunin, right? What was their answer? Jiraiya sighed. They both left Konoha as well, he said. Sakura had never heard him sound so sorrowful. Maybe we were all fated to, one way or another. That might just be how it is. He turned back to Sakura. Tsunade is out there, wandering from town to town and country to country, wasting her life away at the bottom of a bottle. She told me that an institution or ideal can never deserve loyalty. They'll inevitably betray you. It's a fool's errand, only people deserve your loyalty, and only until they betray themselves. That's cynical, Sakura muttered, and Jiraiya shrugged. She lost everyone important to her. From her perspective, it's correct. Orochimaru. He laughed, and Yahiko chuckled as well. He's here, in the Nation of Rain, up to who knows what. Do you two even keep tabs on him? Occasionally, Yahiko admitted. We pop in and make sure he hasn't done anything unforgivable. But he's been very well behaved. Orochimaru. For some reason, the name conjured up a smirking pale face in Sakura's memory, though she was sure she'd never even seen the man before. Weird. He doesn't believe in loyalty, Jiraiya said. Not to the rain, not to the leaf, not to anyone or anything. He'd call it tolerance, I guess. To that guy, it's all about what someone will let him get away with. How useful they can be. That's the only thing he'll ever regard the world with. What about you? Sakura asked. Jiraiya cocked his head, still frozen by the door. What do you think? He asked. Sakura shrugged. I read your book, she said. Tales of a Gutsy Shinobi. Jiraiya and Konan both raised an eyebrow. Yahiko gave a little grin. I think you'd be similar to Tsunade. That you'd be loyal to people, not to the things they build. How'd you get your hands on that? Jiraiya mused. It's been out of print for years. When Sakura stayed silent, he chuckled and kept speaking. You're close. I don't believe in loyalty to an institution either, he said. Sakura smiled, feeling a surge of confidence. I'm loyal to my students, for trying to uphold their vision. I'm loyal to my friends, for the help they've given me. I'm loyal to my publisher, for making me rich. He smirked. I don't have a deeper answer. I'm not a philosopher. That kind of loyalty is enough for me. Before she could respond, he stepped past the door and closed it behind it. Sakura was left with just as many questions as when she'd arrived. Man, Yahiko said with a quiet laugh. He's always so scary to talk to. He stood up, leaving the board on the floor. Always feels like he's picking you apart. Did you really bring me here to talk to him? Sakura asked, and Konan nodded. Of course. It's important that we see how you handle yourself, Sakura, she said. On a mission or in a conversation with a man like him, it doesn't matter. She leaned back in her chair and crossed her legs, black dress flowing. You have enormous potential, it's vital to the nation that you manifest it. Thank you. I think, Sakura said. Was everything in this village a test? Would she ever be able to drop her guard? She'd stopped thinking about it when talking with her peers, like Karen, but now she was more aware than ever that there were extra eyes on her. We are sorry for springing that on you, Yahiko said. He raised his hands. In my defense, it was Konan's idea. Because I was confident she could handle it, Konan said. She smiled. Which she did. Beautifully, considering the circumstances. Her smile faded. However, we did want to discuss something else with you, Sakura. Oh. Sakura took a seat again, trying to maintain eye contact with the both of them. Naturally, it was impossible. Okay. You've performed fantastically on missions, Sakura, Yahiko said, picking a hair off his shirt. Nono and Zabuza have had nothing but praise for you, Naruto, and Sasuke. According to them, you're all more than exceptional. Sakura felt a smile creep across her face but didn't dare speak. She'd already talked too much. I'm sure you've noticed that so far, we've kept your missions confined to Rain and the minor countries, Konan continued. Sakura nodded. We did not want to push you out of your comfort zone, but something has come up, and we believe your team would be an ideal fit for it. Something? Sakura asked. Konan shrugged. The land of lightning and the village hidden in the clouds have been growing more insular with every year, she said. Yahiko laughed. More paranoid, more like, he said, and Konan nodded in agreement. Their daimyo fears the nation more than anything, and he's infected Cloud with that fear. They barely let anyone in nowadays until they're 200% sure that they're not one of our spies. Do you send a lot of spies, I mean? Sakura couldn't help but ask. Yahiko grinned. Oh yeah, he said with a wink. But none have made it very far in. He held up a hand. Now don't get me wrong, we're not asking you to be a spy. Not sure you're really in the right mental space for that. But we want you and your cadre to meet up with someone who is inserting into Cloud. It would be in the land of frost. You'll be helping them sneak in. How? Sakura asked. And who? Konan grinned. By chasing them in. They're an unusual shinobi. Someone who's not a member of any village. Sakura considered. Why are you telling me this? You'll be giving this mission to Zabuza and Nono, if you haven't already. Because you'll be passing through the land of fire for this mission, Yahiko said, suddenly serious. We want to send a larger contingent of your cadre than usual, you, Naruto, Haku, Kabuto, Nono, and Karin. You all have skills that will be critical, and we have another assignment for Suijutsu, Suzuki, and Zabuza besides. We're asking you first, Sakura, because we want to know if you and Naruto will be able to handle it. You may encounter shinobi from the leaf, Konan continued, even if it's unlikely. That's not something we want to subject you to without your consent. Confronting your former comrades can be incredibly painful. Her eyes had a sad cast. We know that more than anyone. Sakura did not and could not afford to hesitate. Yes, she said, and Konan's eyebrow went up at her forthrightness. If we're not ready by now, we never will be. You're making the decision for them, Yahiko said, and Sakura's doubt reared up from within like a snake. That's good enough for me. He straightened up. We'll do something official later, but that's just for the ceremony. People love that stuff. Excuse me? Sakura asked. Sakura, you were denied a promotion, despite having obviously earned it, because you humiliated an ally of your village, Yahiko said. Sakura blinked. As of right this second, you're a Chunin. Got it? You'll be the second in command for this mission. What? Sakura said, and then tried to catch herself. What? Well, since Haku is a member of the Akatsuki, he technically won't have to take your orders, Yahiko mused. But I bet he would. You made an impression on him. Don't I need to do paperwork? Sakura asked, her head spinning. She was a Chunin? Just like that? Shouldn't she have done something? Yahiko snorted. Oh yeah, a lot of it. That's why we kept all the daimyo's bureaucrats around. But you can worry about that later. He gestured towards the door. Go share the good news, and tell Naruto to get ready. You guys will be heading out late tomorrow. Sakura stayed seated for a moment, not sure if she was really being dismissed. You good? Yahiko asked, and she shot to her feet. Yeah. She said, surprised at herself. Was she really that happy to get a promotion? Her heart was singing, wasn't that a little shallow? Or was that the song of validation? My apologies. Thank you. She walked to the door so fast it was almost a run, and heard Konan chuckle behind her. Do the nation proud, the Omekage said, and then the door closed behind her. Sakura breathed out, her whole body shuddering, and found she couldn't contain it. She leapt into the air, letting out a silent yell and throwing out both her hands in pure exultation. She'd done it. Even if it had taken a couple months, she'd been promoted for fighting Gaara. All the doubt and fear that had festered inside her since she'd woken up in the hospital afterwards shot out of her in a single heavy exhalation, and she suddenly felt like she could kick down a building or jump past the clouds. Ahem. She froze as she landed and looked over to find Kimimaro standing farther down the hall. Had he been there the whole time? Sakura felt her face boil. Do you need an escort back? Nope. She said. Her voice came out at an embarrassing pitch. I'm good. Thank you. She fled past him, down the twisting halls and to the high balcony and hurled herself off of it into the rain, sliding down a nearby building and into the city. She had to find Naruto and Sasuke, she thought, her hands tracing the wet steel of the building as she slid down it, chakra sticking her to it like a fly on a wall. She had to let them know about the mission, and to let them know the good news. She'd made Chunin before them. Sakura's cackle echoed through the stormy night. Obito Sensei Chapter 38. Field Trip. Do you think it's gonna get better? Obito asked, wringing out the hand towel and grimacing at the stain on it. He wasn't sure if it was toothpaste or something else, but he probably shouldn't have put it on his eye a second ago. Rin looked him over, tapping his temple with a glowing finger and frowning. I mean, it's pretty much healed. I doubt he put his back in it, she said. They were in his apartment's bathroom, late at night. 3 months ago, Obito wouldn't have dreamed of it. Now, with Rin being one of the only people who bothered to talk to him, he didn't bother second-guessing the situation. You know that's not what I meant, he said, spreading the skin around his eye with 2 fingers and wincing. She was right about that at least, the black eye was already essentially gone. He looked more like he hadn't been getting much sleep, which was definitely the case. Yeah, I know, Rin muttered. I'm gonna kill him. Please don't, Obito said, knowing both that she wasn't serious and that she was absolutely capable of it. I doubt that would help anything, he continued with a little laugh. You can't do something like that, Obito, Rin said after a moment, leaning back against the bathroom wall and crossing her arms. The room was spotless, but only because he'd dumped everything on the sink in the Kamui in a panic the moment she'd knocked on his door, even his toothbrush. Finding that was going to be a hassle. I don't know if you think it'll make them feel better or something, but if some prick like Asuma gets drunk and takes a swing at you, let him fall on his ass. Letting him land a hit like that is only going to make things worse. Obito didn't respond right away, staring at himself in the mirror and wondering if he always looked like such a mess, or if today was special. He was inclined to think it was the latter. It had started with the whispers, and then turned faces and averted eyes. Konoha wasn't populated by stupid people. The fact that Obito had lost his team, the Hokage's son, had spread in just days. By the end of the first week, the blame had been cast. Some had fallen on Sakura's parents. They'd borne it with the steady determination of a couple who believed history was on their side. A little had come to rest on the Uchiha clan's doorstep, but to the rest of the village their loyalty was unquestionable, and the tragedy of Mikato's entire family abandoning her had kept cruelty from her life. That left the lion's share for Obito. This wasn't a schoolyard, the village's judgment wasn't crass. He wasn't called a coward and a fool in the streets, though perhaps behind closed doors. No one denied him service. If he wanted to, he could walk into any restaurant or shop in the village and have a perfectly acceptable experience. But wherever he went, the eyes followed, the whispers followed. It was funny, Obito had to say. If you went after him with a sword, he could laugh it off, step through it like a mild breeze. But there was something far more insidious about words. If there was a technique for stepping through them without leaving them embedded in your soul, he hadn't learned it yet. That pariah status, that void that followed him wherever he went until he decided that going anywhere wasn't worth it, had persisted until today. But today, something had changed. Asuma and Kurane had confronted him while he was training alone. They'd been drunk, they'd said regrettable things, and he'd returned the favor. When Asuma had swung, a dirty haymaker that was all anger and no technique, Obito hadn't even thought about dodging. He'd taken it head-on, determined to not give an inch, and gotten a black eye for his trouble. The Jonin had left like children fearing an adult's attention, an invisible line had been crossed, and Obito was pretty sure it wouldn't happen again. Violence like that was unacceptable. They still had to work together, after all. But the fact that it had happened at all indicated how far things had come. You threw away the village's future, you piece of shit. All 3 of those kids were one of a kind, all that work we put into Sakura was wasted. And you're still here, still training, like you're worth something? You're useless, less than useless. You're sick. Obito. He shook his head, looking back at Rin in the mirror. She bit her lip. Are you going to ask Sensei to do something? Only if it happens again, Obito said with a sigh. Everyone's still hoping they'll just come right back. Every day they don't, it gets a little rawer. Maybe they should, Rin said with a sneer. You don't deserve this. Those morons. Hey, he said, trying to sound firm. My bruise, my decision, okay? And besides, Kushina would do more than just threaten to kill them if it came to that. I just can't stand it. Rin's hands curled into fists. I feel like I don't want you to end up like Kakashi's father, Obito. Obito blinked, straightening up. What do you mean? He asked. Rin's face grew hard. Did you ever ask how Kakashi inherited his sword? No, Obito said, feeling stupid. Even if it was relatively ancient history, he felt a sting of guilt for not knowing more about his deceased teammate. His sensei had told him, long ago, that the White Fang had committed suicide after a mission gone wrong, and that Kakashi had devoted himself to the village in his honor, but little more than that. I figured he just inherited it. He did, Rin said. She leaned forward. But it was also the blade the White Fang used to end his own life. He found it in his father's body. Obito blinked, staring at her. What the fuck? He asked, at a loss for words. How the hell do you know that? Sensei told me, Rin said, her chocolate brown eyes tired and full of obvious, pitiable concern. And he told me to tell you. Shinobi can be cruel, Obito. The White Fang's choice led to the Third War, and all the hatred and pain of it fell on him until he couldn't bear it. Letting Naruto, Sasuke, and Sakura leave isn't nearly as bad as that, but he thought it was weird that the sword passed from one familiar story to another. Obito tried to crack a smile. Maybe it's cursed, he said, and Rin rolled her eyes. I could throw it away. You wouldn't throw away Kakashi's only present, she teased, her voice full of humor and sorrow. Then you'd have to worry about his ghost bullying you too. She froze up in horror for a moment at her own words, but Obito freed her with a laugh. Yeah, and he'd be a lot better at it, he chuckled. He always knew how to knock me down a peg. They paused after that, a silence stretching between them. Obito closed his eyes, wondering why he didn't care more. About the village, about his bruise, about his team. Adversity could bring out the truth, he decided. He'd been solitary before by choice, taking that choice away from him didn't make much of a change. He still had Rin, Guy, his sensei, and Kushina, and his clan. He hadn't lost anything irreplaceable, or broken anything that couldn't be repaired. But still, it hurt. It hurt enough to make his throat close up and his heart struggle. Konoha turning its back on him was the worst pain he'd ever experienced, and it had only been 2 months. He didn't know what he would do if Sakura's mission continued for much longer. His dreams seemed to be only drawing farther away. Maybe I should take a vacation, he suddenly said, and Rin almost jumped. She gave him a suspicious look. Do you mean, like, a sit on the couch in your underwear vacation? She asked, and Obito blushed. Or a run away to a tropical paradise vacation? Neither, he admitted. Was more wondering if Sensei had anything outside of the village. I could get some fresh air. You always did jump into work, Rin said. He couldn't tell if it was a compliment or not. But that might be best, especially now. People have short memories, and absence makes the heart grow fonder. If you left for a bit, morons like that meathead Sarutobi might start missing you. You don't gotta put it so cynically, Obito grumbled. Rin laughed. Can't I just do my job without all those extra considerations? You can, Rin said. But I can't forget them, Obito. Well, I guess it won't hurt for someone to keep track of them, Obito said. Rin pushed herself off the wall, stretching her arms over her head and popping out her chest, and Obito forced himself not to stare. Do you want me to stick around? She asked, and he blinked. We could rent a movie or something, if you don't want to be on your own. She grinned. I've got no plans tonight. That's He swallowed. That's fine. I appreciate it, but I think I'm just gonna go to bed. You sure? She asked, cocking an eyebrow. Obito felt like she was appraising him, but he couldn't tell why. Yeah. He grinned. I think my VHS is broken anyway. He wasn't going to admit that he'd never used it, not since the day he'd been gifted it more than a year ago. Hope you have a good night. They left the bathroom together, Rin regarding him with an inscrutable look the whole time. All right, she said. If you're sure. Don't be afraid to reach out, okay? Come see me if you do end up going on your little odyssey. I will, he said, marveling at how lucky he was. He opened and held the door, and Rin smirked at him as she stepped through. Thanks, Rin. Yeah, she said, waving him off. Just remember, next time let them fall on their ass. There won't be a next time, he said, and she rolled her eyes. But I'll remember. Night, Obito, she said, and pulled the door closed behind her with irresistible strength. ####. The next day came, and Obito did his best to embrace it. That was, until he made it to the front door. Hand resting on the knob, he considered the glances he'd get walking the streets, and dropped his hand. Even if it was childish, he didn't want to deal with that today. So instead of stepping through his door he took a couple steps through space and time, directly into the Hokage's office. The office was, as usual, occupied. However, he'd clearly interrupted a special occasion. Usually the office only held one Hokage, today, it had two. Both his sensei and the Sandaime were seated across from each other, heads bent low and deep in conversation. Some chairs had been pulled from the walls to the center of the room. They both glanced over at him at the same time, inhuman reflexes alerting them to his presence before he had even fully left the Kamui. Obito, his sensei said, the Sandaime nodding in acknowledgement. Good timing, believe it or not. Grab a seat, would you? Obito gave a silent nod and pulled a chair up to form a triangle with the two men, plopping down in it with one leg crossed over the other. The Sandaime sighed, shifting to face him. I must apologize on my son's behalf, he said, sounding tired and old. It was a little unnerving, Obito thought. Even if the man was old, he was always a pillar of surety to the village. Here, dressed in simple clothes and his wrinkles deeper than ever, he seemed less than what he really was. What Asuma did was unforgivable. Biwako has already made her displeasure known. Obito flinched. Biwako Sarutobi was one of the village's most senior medical ninja, and wasn't exactly known for her bedside manner. Rin had told him a couple times she was the only shinobi she was really scared of. Well, I hope you won't mind if I have forgiven him then, Sandaime, he ventured, and the old man chuckled. As you can see, it wasn't anything permanent. No, but something doesn't need to be permanent to matter, the Sandaime said with a smile. Shinobi alone are proof enough of that, after all. His smile faded to a frown. We're concerned, Obito. The both of us. About me. Obito waved them off. I'm fine. I don't want you two going out of your way. The Sandaime knew the truth behind his team's defection as well, of course. His sensei frequently turned to him for advice, even decades into his reign. The man had essentially built Konoha as it was, after all. He's right, Obito, Minato said, steepling his fingers. We've made it very clear to the Jonin commanders that something like that was completely unacceptable, and yet you're still being harassed. Short of coming out and revealing Sakura's defection was planned, we're unable to do more at this point. He frowned, so severe that it probably would have scared anyone else out of the room. I thought better of them. They think I threw away your son, Sensei, Obito said candidly. I'm surprised it hasn't been worse. Well, that's just what we were discussing, the Sandaime said. Obito, we think it may be prudent for you to leave the village for a time. To let wounds heal, as it were. Obito laughed, and the two men stared at him. Beat you to it, he chuckled, and Minato cracked a grin. I was wondering if you had any assignments, Sensei. Nothing very long-term, but enough to keep me busy. Well, that's just the problem, Minato admitted. At the moment, things are relatively quiet. He glanced at the Sandaime. There is one mission I was going to give to Guy, but perhaps it would be a better fit for you. Of course, it probably would only take you a day or two. What is it? Obito said, mulling it over. He considered his harebrained plan from the night before, cooked up after Rin left when he had nothing but himself and his ambition for company. Maybe this would be the perfect fit. You're aware that Kumo has had unusual trade habits in the last few years, Minato said, and Obito nodded. It was a given. Paranoid and insular, the land of lightning and its village hidden in the clouds gave few tells to its activity, and the mass movement of weapons, chakra conductive material, and other unusual trade goods past its border was one of the few ways to keep abreast of its intentions. All of our sources, and the daimyos as well, agree that Kumo is up to something big, but the reality of the matter is top secret. No one has managed to learn a thing beyond the fact that they're building something. He made an unimpressed air quote around the word, and Obito grinned. Something like, what? A bunch of swords? All that metal's going somewhere. Somewhere, Minato agreed, but I doubt it's that mundane. Most likely it's an expansion of their weapons program. Obito nodded, remembering a distant conversation with Rin, from before the Chunin exam, from a different world. It is Cloud's recent actions that may provide further clues. The Sandaime spoke up, his gravelly voice instantly commanding their attention. The government of the Land of Lightning personally reached out to a rogue ninja on their behalf. A rogue? Obito asked, leaning forward. That's not really their style. He is currently being pursued by the Nation of Rain, and apparently seeking sanctuary, the Sandaime continued with a shrug. He is not a defector from any village, he is a rogue in the sense that he is a shinobi without any loyalties. I doubt you have heard of him. What's his name? Obito asked. Katasuke Tauno, the Sandaime said. He was right. Obito hadn't heard of him, and certainly hadn't seen him in any bingo book. By all accounts, he's a genius, Minato elaborated. A reputation with some backing, considering he's maintained his independence for years, until now. He gestured between himself and the Sandaime. We, and I'm sure anyone who is paying attention, are very curious why he of all people would be approached by Cloud, especially when it goes so against their recent goal of only recruiting internally. So you want me to track him down? Obito asked. Why is Rain chasing him? Most likely for the same reason. They want to recruit him, Minato said. His eyes narrowed. They're just being more aggressive about it. And are we recruiting him? Obito said. His sensei shrugged. If we can, he said. We want someone to make contact with and appraise him. If he can be convinced to join Konoha instead, wonderful. If he cannot, then perhaps he can be made to spy on Kumo on our behalf. And if he doesn't agree to either of those, then information is paramount, the Sandaime finished. What kind of shinobi he is, why Cloud may be recruiting him, what he hopes to accomplish with them. He huffed. A man like that is unpredictable. You would be an ideal analyst, Obito, if you'll take the mission. I'll take it, Obito agreed without hesitation, and his sensei gave him a smile. With a condition. A condition? Minato asked, a little surprised. Obito grinned back. Tell me how to find Mayaboku, he said, and both of Minato's eyebrows shot up. Find? He asked. Obito, if you're looking to make a contract with the Toads. I could just ask you, right, Obito said with a wave of his hands. But if I was going to do that, I would have asked years ago, Sensei. I want to seek them out myself. I didn't think I was worthy before. He didn't say it aloud, but it was true. I want to prove that I am. Finding Mayaboku isn't something most people are capable of, Minato mused. You know that, right Obito? Jiraiya told me I wouldn't be able to locate it, even with my Kamui, Obito admitted, and Minato nodded. It's a physical location, but the paths to it are always changing, he said. Obito gave him a quizzical look, that sounded like a bunch of nonsense. It is a mountain in the world, but some of it exists in a parallel space, almost like your Kamui. You could reach it by walking, but it would take months. He scratched his chin. But Jiraiya-sensei may not be completely correct, your Kamui couldn't find it by itself, that's true, but it would give you a pretty unique advantage in locating it. How do you mean? The paths to Mayaboku are treacherous, but the reason they give people so much trouble and take so long to travel is because the natural energy that saturates them causes them to constantly shift, Minato elaborated. But with your Sharingan, I bet you could detect those changes, maybe even account for them. He leaned back. Never thought about it before. It's pretty neat, huh? Obito could feel himself start to get a little excited. And why not? He could afford a little excitement in his life. Where could I get started then? He asked. Minato grinned. The land of frost, funnily enough, he said, and Obito blinked. Almost too convenient to be true, frost-bordered lightning, after all. Along the northern coast, on the dark sea. That would be the best place for you to begin. That's a pretty big coast, Obito laughed. Know it when you see it, thing, huh? Oh yeah, for sure. But I think the toads would complain if I told you more, Minato said. So, when will you head out? Obito stood up. No time like the present, right? He winked. I'll see you soon. Then he stepped out of the office just as abruptly as he'd entered, and left the Hokage to their devices. ####. The nice thing about keeping the Kamui stocked with all sorts of odds and ends was that Obito didn't even have to go home to start his mission. He dropped by the hospital, said goodbye to a startled Rin, don't know when I'll be back. Wait, what dash, and was on his way like that. With both frost and lightning to the north, that was the obvious direction for him to head. First things first, finding out where Kotosuke Tano was last spotted. As ever, Obito counted his lucky stars that Jiraiya had given him access to his information network. It made boring work like this infinitely easier. He visited, in order, a hotel, a bar, a hot spring, a casino, and finally a clothing boutique, and picked up another crumb at each. By the end of it he'd spent over 20,000 ryo in bribes in 6 hours of his day, but his final trip gave him a name to work with. Hayama. The owner of the boutique was an older woman with gray hair and a severe beauty, and Obito suspected the outfit and extravagant hat she was wearing cost as much as some people made in a year. That's where he was last headed. Apparently to meet up with an extraction team from Cloud. Besides that, no one was saying anything. That was, yesterday. Late yesterday. She gave an exaggerated shrug, the dozens of beads strung around her shoulders and hands jangling. Perhaps you could still catch him, Mangekyo no Obito. He'd said his thanks, paid an extra 10,000 ryo to show he was sincere, and then headed towards Hayama. He knew the place on a map, but nothing else about it. It was a small border town nestled in the range of mountains that separated the lands of frost and lightning, with a population that rarely went over 1,000. Mountain towns like that often had a lot of transient groups, people who came to enjoy the summers and then retreated from the harsh winters to more hospitable climates. When Obito arrived, it was already late. Hayama was an hour ahead of Konoha, and the sun had all but set. He wasn't rude enough to pop up in the center of town as he would in many other places. It was one thing to do that with people you knew, and another entirely with strangers. Experience had taught him that it was almost always best to approach in a traditional way. The road that led to the town's main street was narrow and windy, barely wide enough to accommodate a carriage, and Obito walked it gratefully, appreciating the mountain views and the crisp cold air. Obito never considered it consciously, but he had a great love of the freedom to travel the Kamui gave him. To move from the dense forests of the fire to the sparse mountains of frost in an afternoon was thrilling, and he couldn't help but give thanks for it. When he rounded a corner and the town came into view, Obito was a little underwhelmed. It was essentially a single main street covered in stores, restaurants, and other services cut through a mountain pass, with several tributary streets covered in residential buildings. Standard, safe, and mundane. He wasn't sure what he'd been expecting, but it wasn't a very grand reward for a day of work. He ambled into town, hands stuffed into his pockets, and thought back to where Sakura had defected. Atsutsa, right? That town had been much the same, though Hayama seemed even quieter. Maybe it was just the time of day. The streets were empty, and a warm late spring wind whistled through the streets. Several of the buildings were lit up, the sound of music and the smell of food pouring out of them, and Obito set his sights on the nearest one. In a small town like this, a rogue ninja coming through would be on the tip of everyone's tongue. It was, for lack of a better term, a saloon, and Obito quietly pushed the door open and made his way inside. He paused at the entrance for a heartbeat, feeling like he was being watched, but shook the feeling off. The first floor was wide, devoted to tables, chairs, and game tables, with a wide bar dominating the back of the room with 2 doors to either side of it that led up the second and third floor. It was also absolutely stuffed with people. It was a full house, and festivities were in full swing. Everywhere Obito looked, he found people dancing, singing, arguing, gambling, eating and drinking with fervor. The town seemed possessed of a bizarre optimism. It was funny, he thought. If lightning and frost ever came to blows, places like this would be the first to be flattened, torn apart as collateral by the daimyo's armies or battalions of shinobi. Maybe they knew that, maybe living to the fullest now was better than contemplating an uncertain future. There was a pair of seats available at the end of the bar, and he sidled towards it, slipping through the crowd. The farther in he got, the more eyes there were on him. The atmosphere of the saloon didn't deflate, but a fraction of its attention was devoted to him. His Hitaiate was apparent. He was another Furyugen shinobi, the second in as many days if Jiraiya's source was to be believed. The attention was natural. Obito slid onto the stool, and after a minute the ever-busy bartender, a younger man with pitch-black hair and red eyes, made his way over to him. "Can I get you something?" he asked, his voice smooth, and Obito gave him a grin. "Got milk?" he asked, and the bartender laughed. "Sure," he said. Setting up a tab. Obito couldn't help but be impressed. Innocent question with plenty of implications. He liked that. "No, just for the night," he said. The bartender shrugged. 20 ryo then, he said, and then he went to fetch Obito's drink. When he came back with a short ceramic mug, Obito pulled out 2 bills. Each was 100. The bartender eyed him warily. "One's for the drink," he said, and the younger man snorted, an abbreviated laugh. "The other's for some information, if you think you could help." "Oh yeah?" he asked. He held his hand out, and Obito folded both bills neatly and dropped them in the waiting palm. "You're a shinobi, right? From Konoha?" "Yup," Obito said. He took a sip of his drink. To his surprise, it was pretty good. The milk was probably local. He'd seen a couple stables on his way in, and it didn't have any of the chemical taste that something transported up to a town like this would have. "Have you seen any others coming through recently?" "A couple, yeah," the man admitted, his eyes darting towards the entrance. Obito smiled, not turning to look. "Some from the land of lightning, and some from the land of rain." "Rain?" Obito blinked in surprise, and the bartender gave him a curious look. "Really? All the way up here?" "Yeah, I think so," the man said. "I mean, we try to keep track of the symbols, you know, and they had the ones with 3 lines. They were chasing after the lightning folks, seemed like. Anything unique about them?" Obito couldn't help but ask, and the man shook his head. "I didn't see 'em myself," he explained, glancing over Obito's shoulder once again. "If you wanted more specific stuff like that, you'd probably want to talk to Kisame." "Kisame?" Obito asked, before he suddenly realized there was someone behind him. He froze. He'd been aware of the commotion filling the building, even with his back turned, but the nearest table was almost 10 feet away. He hadn't heard the creak of the wood floor, felt an unsteady presence. There was simply someone there now, appearing without warning. If they'd snuck up on him like that, they had to be a shinobi. The bartender had seen them approach, he just had been stupid and macho and not looked back himself. Obito didn't make any sudden moves as the ninja behind him stepped to the side, settling down on the stool next to him. He glanced to the right, trying to seem non-threatening, and then up. The man who'd taken a seat at his side was enormous, easily 7 feet tall and more than twice Obito's width at the shoulders. He wore a tan shirt with a brown vest and simple blue pants with a belt, and there was something wrapped around his neck and hanging down his back, like a scarf made of razor scales. As Obito watched, it shifted like a living thing, settling into a more comfortable position. That was noteworthy, but so was the man himself. His skin was a dull blue, and his eyes were small pale dots in a harsh and wide face. He looked over at Obito and grinned, and Obito saw that his teeth were sharp and triangular, filed or natural, he couldn't tell. They reminded him of a shark. So, the man asked. What brings you to my town, Obito Uchiha? With his surprise buried, Obito didn't hesitate. He finished his drink and stuck out his hand. You've got me at a disadvantage, he admitted, and the man laughed. You know me, but unfortunately, I don't know you. Kisame Hoshigaki, the man rumbled with obvious amusement, refusing to take Obito's hand. Obviously he knew what Obito's touch could do. Not here to cause trouble, are you? Kisame. He hadn't heard the name until a moment ago, but the man exuded so much obvious power and authority that Obito was baffled at how that could be the case. I don't think so, he said, withdrawing his hand. I'm looking for someone, that's all. Those shinobi who came through here earlier, Kisame, the bartender spoke up, and Kisame gave him an amused look. The ones that almost started a fight. Figures, the man grunted. So which ones were you after, Uchiha? The bastards from Rain, or the cowards from Cloud? Neither, Obito said. I was told the shinobi from Cloud were escorting a man. Another shinobi, younger. He's the one I'm looking for. That little guy? Kisame asked. Huh. Guess there was more to him than meets the eye. He leaned back. They were here, yeah. Should still be pretty close, I bet. Some of them were pretty hurt. Hurt? Obito asked. I thought it was almost starting a fight. Kisame laughed. They had the good sense to wait until they were out of town, he said, flashing his teeth. But one of them ended up with their arm half frozen, and that pink-haired girl almost took another's head off. Last I saw of them, they were laying low in one of Cloud's little outposts, past the border. Obito's brain short-circuited. Pink hair? He blinked, and Kisame saw his hesitation. You know them. He grunted. Obito gave him a suspicious look. Pink hair? Green eyes? He asked, and Kisame gave him a flat look, his shark-like eyes not betraying a thing. Did she use a water sword? Yeah, you know her. The bartender brought the hulking shinobi a glass of water. Funny. You run into her before? She seemed pretty wild. She was my student, Obito said, and to his satisfaction the man coughed, almost choking on his water. Really? He said with a laugh, setting the glass back down. What the hell did you teach her? I didn't realize Leaf and Rain were exchanging kids now. We aren't, Obito grumbled. She ran away. Just as well, Kisame said, and Obito gave him a cockeyed look. What was someone like this doing out here? The bartender was familiar with him, had spoken of him on a first-name basis. That was something most shinobi did, a relic of the constant clan wars of the past, but many civilians didn't grow friendly enough with them to be comfortable speaking so informally. As he looked around, he realized that despite his size and appearance, Kisame was completely at home in the saloon. Obito was the one sticking out and drawing attention, while the shark man was just another familiar face. Everyone here knew him. Well anyway, that's a hell of a coincidence, Kisame continued. You sure she's not the one you're chasing? She and the rest went west, probably heading back to that dump of a country they came from. He sneered, and Obito shook his head. I'm sure. There were others with her? Obito asked, and Kisame shrugged. A couple. Kid with glasses, a girl with red hair, some blonde punk with scars. He drew fingers across his cheeks, and Obito's eyes were drawn to the gill-like protrusions there, like this. There were more, but I didn't see them. Obito leaned back, lost in thought. Two of his students here in the Land of Frost, and just the day before. Where was Sasuke? Still back in Rain. Why had Sakura and Naruto been here? Were they the team chasing Katasuke? Were they already that trusted? If that was the case, it was fantastic beyond words. Of course, them being here also went beyond coincidence into frightening. What if he'd asked for the mission the day before? Could he have handled seeing them? Obito didn't know, and he was almost glad he hadn't found out. Course, Kisame said, I'm only telling this so you'll get lost. If you stick around, you're liable to attract trouble. What, me? Obito asked with a bit of a bite, and Kisame laughed. What about you? I'm here so there isn't trouble, Kisame said with a raised eyebrow. You gonna get lost or not? Obito considered. Tell you what, he said. You lead me to that outpost, I'll get out of your hair. ASAP. Kisame gave him an unreadable look, his beady eyes narrowing. After a moment, he grunted and finished his water, gently placing it back on the counter with a grateful nod to the bartender. Fine, he said. If that'll get you on your way. He stood up, towering over Obito, and his scaly scarf shifted again, adjusting itself to drape farther down his back. Let's go now, huh? While they're still licking their wounds. Obito finished his milk and left the counter behind, following Kisame as the hulking man forged a path out of the bustling saloon. When they stepped outside, he realized the sun had already set, the mountains were draped in shadows, and the wind was growing colder. Kisame glanced back at him, a couple of his teeth bared in a half-grin. It's gonna be to the north. Hope you don't mind a walk, Uchiha. He set off down the main and only street, and Obito hustled after him, having to take 2 steps for each of Kisame's. I'll admit, he eventually said as they cleared the town and started heading into the rocky wilderness of the mountains. I came to find that man, but I didn't think I'd find someone like you. Are you flirting with me? Kisame grunted, and Obito laughed. Just curious, he said, and then almost bit his tongue when he realized how that had come out. I've never heard of you, but you got right behind me without me noticing a thing. There aren't many people around who can do that. They moved off the road, picking up the pace and gliding between scrub oak and stone inclines. Maybe you've just got a high opinion of yourself, Kisame said with a chuckle. Obito rolled his eyes. Don't think anyone's accused me of that before, he said. Kisame laughed again, this time a little more genuinely. What are you doing in a town like Hayami? It was plain enough that everyone there knew you. You must have been there for a while. Long enough, Kisame said, glancing back as they began climbing a hill far too steep for anyone but a shinobi, loose chunks of rock skittering away beneath them. Why do you care? Like I said, I'm just curious, Obito said, doing his best to appear non-threatening. He normally would have activated his Sharingan to see better in the dark, but he could tell that around Kisame, that might not be the best idea. Kisame considered that as they climbed, seemingly content with the silence. Just when Obito was sure he wasn't going to reply, he spoke. About 10 years. That long? Obito asked. Are you from the land of frost? Water? Listen, seriously, why do you care? Kisame gave him a narrow glare. You don't strike me as a bounty hunter. Do you have a bounty?